Are you taking care of my father, or hunting for his money? Richard Harlan's voice rang out from the doorway. Annie stood frozen beside Arthur Harlan's wheelchair. Her hand was still resting lightly on his, as if the moment she let go, the old man would lose the last bit of strength he had left. She spun around. In that instant, all the color seemed to drain from her face. I didn't, Annie stammered. Sir, I didn't take anything. I didn't take anything at all. Richard stepped into the room, his coat still on, his tie pulled crooked from his hurried drive back from downtown Charleston. His face was dark with anger. He looked at Annie's hand resting on his father's hand, then at the stack of papers on the desk. Then he looked back at her, as if the entire room had already confessed on her behalf. Tell me, Richard growled. How much? How much money have you taken from my father? Annie's lips trembled. No, sir, please, I swear. You swear? Richard cut her off. You think I still believe words like that? Arthur Harlan sat in his wheelchair beside the desk. His face was pale, his shoulders trembling slightly. His left hand still held the pen, though his fingers were too weak to keep it steady. He tried to turn toward his son. He tried to speak before everything went too far. Richard, Arthur's voice was hoarse. Listen to me. But Richard was no longer listening to anyone. His eyes dropped again to the papers on the desk. He lunged forward, snatched the documents from Annie's hand, and threw them hard across the desktop. Several pages slid over the edge and scattered onto the floor. What the hell is this? He shouted. Do you people think I'm stupid? You're taking advantage of him, aren't you? Forcing him to sign inheritance papers while I'm not home? Annie stepped back as if the words had struck her across the face. No, sir, they're not. Not what? Richard's voice grew colder. Not inheritance papers? Not a scam? Not a chance to get money before someone caught you? Arthur's hand struck the armrest of his wheelchair. The sound was not loud, but it was full of desperation. You, Arthur gasped. You foolish son. He could not finish the sentence. His throat tightened. The words he wanted to say were trapped inside his old, weakened chest. Before Arthur could catch his breath, Margaret Bell hurried into the study from the hallway. She wore a neat black dress, her silver hair pinned tightly at the back of her head, her face arranged into a look of concern that was far too practiced. Mr. Harlan, Margaret said, breathless. Thank God you're home. I was terribly worried. Richard turned sharply toward her. Tell me exactly what you saw. Margaret placed one hand over her chest, then glanced toward Annie as if she were looking at something shameful. After you left for your meeting, sir, I came down the hall to check on your father. I saw Annie standing exactly where she is now. She had a pen, she had papers, and she was holding your father's hand. That isn't true, Annie whispered. Mr. Harlan was holding the pen. Margaret raised her voice just enough to drown her out. She was leaning close to him, speaking very softly. Your father looked confused. He seemed unwilling. But she kept holding his hand and guiding the pen down to the paper. I was afraid she was taking advantage of the fact that he is not as strong as he used to be. Arthur's eyes widened with rage. No, he forced out. No. Margaret turned to him with false sweetness. Mr. Harlan, please don't upset yourself. We all know you are a kind man, too kind. Some people see kindness and mistake it for weakness. Annie looked at Margaret as tears began to rise in her eyes. How can you say that? You weren't in the room. You didn't hear him ask me. Margaret's expression hardened at once. Watch your tone. Richard took another step toward Annie. My father asked you? Yes, sir. Annie's voice caught. He asked me because his hand was shaking too badly. I told him I shouldn't touch the papers. I told him I was afraid to help. But he asked me again. I was only keeping his hand steady. Richard let out a dry laugh without a trace of warmth. How convenient. It's the truth. The truth? His eyes burned. The truth is that you became far too comfortable in this house. You poured tea for him, pushed his chair, smiled at him, made him trust you. Then the moment I left the house, you put papers in front of him. Annie shook her head again and again. No, sir, please don't say that. She looked painfully small in that large room, standing between the heavy desk and the doorway. Her gray uniform was wrinkled at the sleeves. Her eyes were red, her hands trembled, but she still held them close to her chest. I don't want anything from him, she said. I just didn't want his hand to shake so badly that it hurt him. Richard did not soften. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, pulled out a thick stack of cash he had intended to give to a contractor that afternoon and threw it at Annie's feet. The bills burst apart and scattered across the floor near her worn shoes. "Here," he said, "take it. Isn't this what you came here for?" Annie looked down at the money. The tears finally fell, but she did not bend down. She did not touch even a single bill. "I didn't come here for your money," she said. Richard leaned toward her. "Girls like you always say that after they get caught." Arthur released a broken groan from his wheelchair. His face twisted in pain, not because of illness, but because he was ashamed of his own son. "Richard," he gasped. "Stop." Margaret stepped closer to Richard and lowered her voice. "Sir, I don't want to hurt you more, but I have proof. I recorded part of it because I was afraid no one would believe me." Richard turned sharply. "You recorded it?" "Yes, sir." Margaret took out her phone. "Only a few seconds. I knew it looked terrible. And I thought you had the right to know what was happening in your own home." Annie's face went pale. "You recorded me?" Margaret did not answer. She tapped the screen, then handed the phone to Richard. The video was slightly shaky, filmed from the end of the hallway through the partially open study door. It showed Annie standing beside Arthur's wheelchair. It showed her hand over his trembling hand. It showed the pen moving at the bottom of a page. It showed documents spread across the desk. But it did not show the titles of those documents. It did not show Annie refusing to help at first. It did not record the phone call to the lawyer's office. It did not show that Arthur had begged her to help him keep the pen steady. Richard watched the video once, then he watched it again. His face hardened. Margaret seized the opportunity at once. "You see, I wish I had been wrong. I truly do." But she was clearly holding his hand and making him sign. "Your father could hardly resist her. She waited until you were gone." "No," Annie cried, her voice breaking. "That is not what happened. Please, Mr. Harlan, that video doesn't show what he said. It doesn't show him asking me. It doesn't show anything that happened before." Richard looked at her with disgust. "It shows enough." "No, it doesn't," Annie said, shaking her head. Please ask him. Ask your father. He knows the truth." Arthur's breathing grew faster. His hand tightened around the armrest of the wheelchair. His eyes moved from Richard to Margaret, then back to Annie. The girl stood there crying silently, money lying at her feet, while no one was willing to hear her. Margaret pointed at Annie, her voice rising as she began to believe victory was already in her hands. "She took advantage of him, sir. The moment you left, she brought out the pen and those papers. Your father is not as clear-minded as he used to be. He is weak, and she knows it. She used that soft little voice, stood close to him, acted gentle, and put the pen in his hand. I saw it with my own eyes. I recorded it. What more proof do we need?" Annie covered her mouth with a trembling hand. Tears ran endlessly down her cheeks. "I didn't force him," she whispered. "I would never do that to him. He has been so kind to me. I only wanted to help." Margaret turned toward her, her mouth curling with contempt. "You mean you wanted to help yourself?" Suddenly, Arthur used every bit of strength he had left and slammed his hand down on the armrest of his wheelchair. "Enough." The entire room went silent. Arthur's voice was hoarse, cracked by age and illness, but the anger inside it was strong enough to cut through every lie. "Be quiet, right now." Margaret's mouth snapped shut. Richard froze, startled by the sudden force in his father's voice. Arthur's chest rose and fell with difficulty. He tried to lift one trembling hand toward the papers Richard had thrown aside. "Richard," he said, each word heavy as stone. "You, fool." Richard stared at him. "Dad?" Arthur pointed again toward the documents. His arm shook so violently that Annie instinctively took one small step forward, ready to support him. Richard immediately snapped, "Don't." Annie stopped at once. Arthur looked at his son, his eyes wet with anger and pain. "Read," he struggled to say. "Read the documents." Richard did not move. Margaret was the first to regain her composure. "Sir, honestly, your father is very upset. We shouldn't let her confuse him anymore." Arthur slowly turned his head toward her. His eyes sharpened. "No." One word, but it made the whole room feel colder. Annie stood near the desk, crying quietly. She looked at Arthur as if that single word was the last piece of kindness left in the house. Richard looked down at the documents scattered across the desk and the floor, but anger was still clouding his judgment. He pointed toward the door. "Margaret," he said, his voice lower but still hard as stone, Pack her things. Annie's head snapped up. Sir, please read them first. Please. Richard did not answer. Margaret nodded immediately. Yes, sir. Arthur tried to push his wheelchair forward, but one wheel caught on the edge of the rug. His trembling hand reached toward Annie. Annie, he called. She turned to him, tears running down her cheeks. I'm sorry, Mr. Harlan. I'm so sorry. Richard stepped between them. Don't ever touch him again. Annie froze. That sentence hurt her more than the money thrown at her feet, more than Margaret's lies, more than Richard's furious shouting, because she was not just losing a job. She was losing someone who had once trusted her. Margaret grabbed Annie's arm and pulled her toward the door. As she was led into the hallway, Annie looked back one last time. Arthur sat helplessly in his wheelchair, his mouth open, his trembling hand raised in the air. He was still trying to protect her with a body that no longer obeyed him. On the desk and across the floor, the papers Richard had thrown aside remained scattered everywhere. Margaret dragged Annie down the hallway as if she were pulling a stain out of the house. Annie did not resist, not because she agreed, not because she had nothing left to say. She walked only because her legs were still able to move, while her heart felt as if it had been left behind in the study. From inside that room, Arthur's broken voice called out, Annie. She stopped immediately. Margaret tightened her grip on Annie's arm. Keep moving. Annie turned her head and looked back. Richard stood near the study door, his body stiff with anger. Behind him, Arthur sat in his wheelchair, one trembling hand still reaching toward her. His face was filled with fear, not fear for himself, but for her. Mr. Harlan, Annie said, her voice choking. Please don't be upset, please. Richard's voice rang coldly through the hallway. Don't speak to my father. Annie lowered her head. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing more. Margaret let out a small breath of relief, then continued pulling her away. They passed the dining room, where the long table had already been set. Crystal glasses shone under the lights. Silverware lay in perfect lines. A proper dinner was waiting inside that house, while kindness itself had just been thrown out. At the end of the hallway, two young maids stood beside a linen cart. Beth looked at Annie with wide eyes. The other one, Marcy, leaned toward Beth and whispered, quietly enough to pretend to be discreet, but loudly enough for Annie to hear. I heard she talked the old man into signing something. Beth glanced toward Margaret. You mean Mr. Harlan? Marcy nodded. That's what Mrs. Bell said. Papers, money, maybe even a will. I knew something wasn't right. She was always hanging around his study. Annie stopped as if the floor had cracked beneath her feet. That isn't true, she said. Marcy's face flushed slightly, but she did not apologize. I'm only repeating what everyone is saying. Which people? Annie asked, tears rolling down her cheeks. You mean her? Margaret turned back. Her face was sharp as a blade, but there was pleasure hidden in her eyes. The rumor had begun to spread, and she was enjoying every second of it. Annie, don't embarrass yourself any further, Margaret said. The staff is watching. Beth looked down uneasily. I didn't see anything. Margaret gave her a warning look. Then you should say even less. Marcy crossed her arms. Mrs. Bell saw it. Mr. Richard saw the video too. Isn't that enough? Annie's face twisted with pain. The video doesn't show what happened before. It doesn't show him asking me. It doesn't show that I called the lawyer's office. Margaret gave a soft laugh. This time, she did not bother lowering her voice. Oh, now there's a lawyer involved too. How convenient. Annie looked around at the faces in front of her. No one stepped forward. No one asked what the papers actually were. No one asked why Arthur had tried so hard to speak that he had nearly choked. They only looked at her as if a rumor, repeated quickly enough, could somehow become the truth. Richard appeared at the end of the hallway. Immediately, Margaret changed. Her shoulders relaxed. Her voice became soft, polished, and obedient. Mr. Harlan, she said, hurrying toward him, please don't trouble yourself any further. I'm handling everything. You've already been through too much this morning. Richard looked at Annie, not exactly at her, through her. Why is she still here? I'm taking care of it, sir, Margaret said. You were right to come home. Truly. If you had been only an hour later, who knows what might have happened? Annie cried out through her tears. Happened? I didn't do anything wrong. Margaret turned to Richard with a look of concern that was far too well performed. You see, sir? She still refuses to take responsibility. That worries me even more. A truly remorseful person would be afraid. She is trying to justify herself. I'm afraid because no one will listen to me, Annie said. Richard's eyes narrowed. You had time to speak in my father's study. No, sir, Annie replied. You were shouting before I could finish a sentence. Margaret immediately stepped in. Mr. Harlan, please don't let her draw you into this. Your father was in danger. That is what matters. You are doing what any devoted son would do. Those words struck Richard exactly where Margaret wanted them to. He was silent for a second, then said, Pack her things. Margaret bowed her head slightly. Yes, sir. I will personally make sure she leaves the property. Then she turned back to Annie. The sweetness vanished from her face like a mask being removed. Move. Annie walked toward the staff quarters. The two maids stepped aside. Marcy watched her with something almost eager in her eyes, as if Annie's humiliation would give her something to talk about for days. Beth looked down at the linen cart, unable to meet her eyes. Beth, Annie said, her voice almost pleading, you know I have never taken anything. Beth's eyes were full of pity, but pity was not courage. I don't know what happened, Beth said softly. Annie nodded once, and that answer hurt her more than an accusation, because sometimes saying you do not know the truth is just another way of keeping yourself safe. In the staff kitchen, Lila stood near the sink with a towel in her hand. The moment she saw Annie's tear-streaked face, she stepped forward. Lord have mercy, what have they done to you, child? Margaret snapped. Get back to work, Lila. Lila looked at Richard. He had followed them only far enough to make sure his order was being carried out. Margaret quickly moved to his side. Sir, I know this is painful, she said, but you have always trusted me to protect this family. I would never have called you home if I did not truly believe your father was in danger. Richard nodded without looking at Annie. I know, Margaret. By then, Annie could no longer hold herself together. She broke down, not the loud kind of crying meant to draw sympathy, but the cry of someone who had tried to stand upright for too long, until one more push made everything inside her break. Her shoulders shook. She covered her mouth with both hands, trying to swallow the sobs, but the tears kept falling. Mr. Harlan, she said through her crying, please, I'm begging you, read those papers. Please read them before you send me away. Richard's jaw tightened. I've heard enough. Margaret's face brightened for one brief moment before she hid it. You heard him. She pushed open the door to the small staff room. Annie's brown suitcase sat beside the narrow bed she used on long workdays. Margaret grabbed it and threw it onto the bed. Pack. Annie wiped her face with the sleeve of her uniform. Her hands shook as she folded each piece of clothing. A sweater slipped from her hands and fell to the floor. A notebook opened, revealing pages of notes about nursing programs. She quickly picked it up, but Margaret had already seen it. Nursing? Margaret said. So that was your plan? Get close to a sick old man and call it caregiving experience? Annie hugged the notebook tightly to her chest. Don't make everything ugly. Please. I only want to help people. You wanted access. No, Annie said, her voice breaking through her tears. I wanted a future. For a moment, Lila appeared in the doorway. Margaret, at least let the girl call her mother. She can call from outside. Annie looked up. I don't have anyone to pick me up. Margaret yanked the suitcase hard. Then take the bus. You found your way here when you wanted money. Richard stood silently in the hallway. Annie looked at him one last time, hoping to see even the smallest crack in his anger. Sir, she said, your father knows the truth. Richard turned his face away, and that was enough. That was his answer. Margaret dragged the suitcase through the back door and dropped it hard onto the steps. The suitcase tipped to one side. Annie's sweater fell out and landed on the damp ground. Annie bent down to pick it up, sobbing too openly to hide her pain. She stood there under the eyes of the two maids in the hallway, before Lila, who was silently wiping her tears, before Margaret, whose face was filled with satisfaction, and before Richard, who still refused to read the papers. From inside the house, Arthur's voice rang out, strained and furious. Richard. Annie froze. Hope rose inside her so quickly it almost hurt, but Margaret pointed toward the service gate. Get out. Annie gripped the handle of her suitcase with both hands. The broken wheel scraped against the stone path, making a dry, harsh sound as she walked away. At the gate, she turned back toward Arthur's study window. The curtain unmoved slightly, and through the glass, she saw the shape of his wheelchair near the window. Annie raised one trembling hand. "I did not betray you," she said through her tears. Then she stepped through the gate. If Annie's words touched your heart, please give this video a like. Comment below and tell us where you are watching from today. No one should have to stand alone when the truth is being buried. Subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories about justice, loyalty, and the power of truth. Carrying her old suitcase, carrying the dignity that had just been crushed beneath other people's lies, and leaving behind a truth still trapped inside that house, beside a man too weak to run after her, but still trying to call her name with every breath he had left. Inside the study, Richard hears the back gate close. The sound is small, almost nothing, but Arthur reacts as if a door has shut on his chest. His hand remains lifted toward the window long after Annie is gone. The curtain moves slightly from the air vent, then settles. The side lawn is empty. The stone path is empty. The girl who has been accused of hunting for money leaves with a broken suitcase and no one to defend her except an old man trapped in a wheelchair. Richard stands behind Arthur, still holding his anger because without it he has nothing to stand on. "She had to go," he says. Arthur does not turn. His shoulders rise and fall with hard breaths. Richard tries again, this time lower. "Dad, I know you're upset, but you don't understand what nearly happened." Arthur's fingers curl against the window frame. He turns the chair slowly, one weak push at a time. The effort makes his face tighten, but he refuses Richard's help when Richard steps forward. "Don't," Arthur says. Richard stops. The word is not loud, but it lands with more force than shouting. Arthur looks at his son, and for the first time that morning, Richard feels something colder than anger. He feels judgment. Margaret appears at the study door with Richard's coffee on a tray. Her face has returned to its careful softness. "Sir," she says, "I thought you might need this. You've had a terrible shock." Richard takes the cup without looking away from his father. "Thank you, Margaret." She steps into the room and looks at the scattered papers. "Would you like me to gather those? We should probably keep them somewhere safe until your attorney reviews them." Arthur's hand strikes the armrest. "No." Margaret pauses. "Mr. Harlan, I only mean out." Richard frowns. "Dad." Arthur's eyes stay on Margaret. His voice shakes, but the meaning does not. "Out." Margaret's mouth tightens. For a second her mask slips, and Richard sees irritation, not concern. Then it disappears. "Of course, Mr. Harlan," she says. "I only want what is best for you." Arthur looks away as if the words make him tired. Margaret turns to Richard. "I'll be just outside if you need me." When she leaves, the room feels different, quieter, but not calmer. The money is still on the floor. The documents are still scattered across the desk and rug. Richard sets the coffee down untouched. Arthur points toward the papers. Richard sighs. "Dad, we'll have Daniel look at them." "Now." Richard stiffens. "You need rest." Arthur's hand trembles harder. "Read." Richard looks at him, annoyed and uneasy. "Fine." He bends and picks up the nearest page. It is not the first page. Only a middle section filled with formal language and property descriptions. Richard scans it too fast. "Transfer of land," he says. "That's exactly what I thought." Arthur closes his eyes in frustration. Richard lifts another page. 40 acres. "Dad, do you understand what this is? That parcel is worth millions." Arthur opens his eyes. "Yes." The answer is clear enough to make Richard pause. "You knew?" Arthur breathes through his nose, gathering strength. "Mine." Richard's voice sharpens. "It is family land." Arthur's hand moves once, slow and deliberate, toward his own chest. "Mine." Richard looks down at the page again. He notices the name of the receiving organization for the first time, Low Country Public Land Trust. He reads it twice, not because he does not understand the words, but because they do not fit the story he has been telling himself. "What is this?" he asks. Arthur leans back, exhausted already. "Louise." Richard's face changes at the name of his mother. Arthur points toward the window, toward the trees beyond the lawn, the old oaks and the narrow path leading toward the lake. "Your mother loved there." Richard says nothing. Arthur continues, forcing each word through a mouth that refuses to cooperate. "Not houses, not gates, trees." Richard grips the paper tighter. "You were donating the land?" Arthur glares at him. "Yes." The room seems to shift around Richard. He looks down at the papers again, this time slower. "Donation agreement. Conservation easement." Public access trail. No private development. No sale to commercial builders. Arthur James Harlan, grantor. There is no inheritance clause. No transfer to Annie. No payment. No gift. No secret signature giving a maid access to anything. Richard's throat tightens, but he fights it. Why didn't you tell me? Arthur lets out a bitter breath that almost sounds like a laugh. You never stay. Richard looks up. Arthur does not soften. You come. You talk. To doctors. To Margaret. To lawyers. Not me. The words cut because they are simple and because they are true. Richard folds the page once, then opens it again, suddenly unsure what to do with his hands. That doesn't explain Annie. Arthur's eyes harden. I asked. Richard looks away. Dad, Margaret has video. Arthur's jaw tightens. Video, Richard says, as if repeating the word can make it stronger. It showed her holding your hand. Arthur raises his left hand, the one that still shakes. He holds it in the air between them. It trembles so badly Richard cannot ignore it. Look. Richard looks. Arthur reaches toward the pen on the desk, trying to pick it up. His fingers close too late. The pen rolls away. He tries again. His knuckles knock against the wood. The pen falls to the rug. Richard bends automatically to pick it up. Arthur snaps. No. Richard freezes. Arthur tries again. He leans forward, breathing hard. His fingers shaking over the rug. It takes him nearly half a minute to get the pen between two fingers. By then his face is damp with effort. He lifts it only an inch before it slips again. The pen lands beside the money. Arthur looks at Richard. She helped. Richard's chest tightens. He remembers Annie's voice. I just didn't want his hand to shake so badly. He pushes the memory away because if he lets it in fully, something inside him will break. Why her? He asks. Arthur answers without delay. She listens. Richard has no defense for that. From the hallway, Margaret's voice rises, sweet and busy, speaking to someone on the staff. Yes, Mr. Harlan is handling it. Poor man. Imagine finding that girl with papers in front of his father. We must all be more careful now. Richard hears it. So does Arthur. Arthur turns his head toward the door. Lies, he says. Richard says nothing. Arthur's eyes return to him. You believed. Richard's jaw tightens. I believed what I saw. Arthur shakes his head slowly. No, you believed. What you wanted. The words sit between them. Richard looks toward the doorway where Annie had disappeared. He sees again her face when Margaret played the video, the way she tried to explain, the way her voice broke when she begged him to read the papers. He sees the money at her feet and hears his own words. Girls like you. For the first time, the sentence sounds different in his memory. Not protective, not strong, ugly. Still, pride does not surrender all at once. I was angry, Richard says. Arthur's answer comes rough. At her or yourself? Richard looks back at him sharply. Arthur breathes hard, but he continues. She was here. You were not. That one reaches deeper than Richard expects. He turns away and walks to the desk. The family photograph beside the lamp has been turned slightly toward Arthur's chair. It shows Louise Harlan in the garden years ago, one hand resting on the gate that leads to the woods. Richard had passed that photo 100 times without seeing it. Annie must have turned it so Arthur could see it. Richard picks up the first page of the agreement at last. The title is clear, Public Land Conservation Donation Agreement. Below it is Arthur's name. Below that, in uneven ink, is the signature Annie had helped steady. Richard reads every word now. His anger drains too slowly to be called relief. What replaces it is worse. Arthur watches him read. When Richard reaches the final page, his face has gone pale. Daniel prepared this? He asks. Arthur Gohailan Lintaivin. Yes. Richard closes his eyes. And Annie called his office? Arthur Gon Hailan again. Richard opens his eyes. She asked permission? Arthur Gon Hailan harder. Richard's hand falls to his side. From the hallway, Margaret steps in again, unable to stay away. Sir, I can call security to make sure she doesn't return. It may also be wise to notify the agency before she twists the story. Arthur slams his palm onto the armrest. Enough. Margaret stops. Richard turns to her slowly. For the first time that morning, He does not look certain. Margaret notices and quickly softens her voice. Mr. Harlan, I am only trying to protect your family. Arthur points a shaking finger at her. No, yourself. Margaret's face drains of color. Richard looks from his father to Margaret, then down at the phone in her hand. Show me the video again, he says. Margaret hesitates. Sir? The whole thing. It was only a few seconds. Then show me the few seconds. She unlocks her phone. The video plays again. Annie's hand, Arthur's hand, the pen, the paper. Richard watches more carefully now. Annie's posture is not greedy or secretive. She looks tense, careful, afraid. Arthur is not pulling away. He is leaning into the support. When the clip ends, Richard's voice is quiet. Where is the beginning? Margaret blinks. That is all I recorded. The part where she brought the papers in? I did not see that. The part where he refused? I assumed. Richard looks up. You assumed. Margaret says nothing. Arthur lets out one sharp breath, almost a verdict. Richard turns toward the security camera mounted near the ceiling of the study. For years it has been part of the house, ignored unless something valuable goes missing. Now he sees it as the only witness that did not flatter him, fear him, or lie to him. Get Paul, Richard says. I want the study footage. Margaret's face tightens. Sir, is that necessary? Arthur answers before Richard can. Yes. Richard looks at the money still lying on the floor, at the papers in his hand, at the empty doorway where Annie has vanished. His stomach turns. Yes, he says, but this time his voice is not angry. It is afraid. Paul arrives in the study with his cap in his hands and worry on his face. He is young enough to still believe that telling the truth should be simple, but he has worked in the Harlan house long enough to know that simple things become dangerous when powerful people are embarrassed. Richard stands near the desk with the land donation papers in his hand. Arthur sits by the window, breathing hard but alert. Margaret remains beside the door, straight-backed, watching Paul as if she can push him into silence with her eyes. Richard points toward the small camera in the corner of the room. I need the footage from this morning. Paul swallows. Yes, sir. From the time my father first entered the study until Annie left. Margaret steps forward at once. Mr. Harlan, that may take some time. Perhaps your father should rest first. He has had too much excitement. Arthur's fingers strike the armrest once. No. Richard looks at Margaret. Paul, do it now. Paul nods and leads them to the security room near the service entrance. Richard pushes Arthur's wheelchair himself. No one comments on it, but everyone notices. Margaret follows close behind, her hands folded too tightly at her waist. The security room is small, with 2 monitors, a keyboard, and a faint smell of burnt coffee. Paul sits at the desk and pulls up the morning recordings. His fingers move carefully, as if one wrong key could cost him his job. What time, he asks. Richard turns to Arthur. Dad? Arthur closes his eyes, thinking. 9:20. Paul searches the file, then opens the footage. The screen shows the study from above. Arthur is already near the desk. The morning light falls across the papers. For a few seconds, nothing happens. Then Annie enters with a tea tray. Richard folds his arms, ready to watch the proof against her disappear or become worse. He does not know which one frightens him more. On the screen, Annie sets the tray down and speaks to Arthur. There is no audio from this camera, only movement. She points toward the curtains. Arthur taps twice on the armrest. Annie opens them halfway, not too much, just enough to soften the room. She places a cup near him, then starts to leave. Arthur lifts his hand. Annie stops. He points to the documents. Richard leans closer to the monitor. Arthur points to the pen, then to his shaking hand. Annie steps back at once, shaking her head. Even without sound, the refusal is clear. She holds both palms up, nervous, careful, saying no. Arthur insists. Annie looks toward the door, then back at him. She takes out her phone. She does not touch the papers. She makes a call and places the phone on the desk. She waits. She listens. She nods. She turns the phone slightly toward Arthur, as if making sure he can hear too. Paul glances at Richard. Sir, she called someone. Richard's mouth is dry. I see that. Margaret quickly says, we don't know who. Arthur answers, lawyer. Richard does not look at Margaret. Keep playing. On the screen, Annie points to the pen. then to Arthur, then to herself, clearly explaining limits. Arthur nods. She still hesitates. He taps twice. Only then does she move beside him. Richard watches her place her hand beneath Arthur's wrist. Not over it, not forcing it down, not controlling the pen. She steadies him the way someone might steady a glass of water in the hand of a person they respect too much to take it away. Arthur signs. The signature takes time. Annie does not hurry him. Once his hand slips, she pulls back instead of pushing forward. Arthur pauses, breathes, then continues. When the last stroke is done, Annie releases him immediately. She clasps her own hands together as if relieved. Then Arthur smiles. Richard feels something twist inside him. Paul stops the footage by accident. "Sorry, sir." "No," Richard says quietly. "Go back 10 seconds. Paul does. They watch again. Arthur smiles at Annie, and Annie smiles back with tears in her eyes. Not the tears of someone who has won money, but of someone who has helped an old man finish something that matters to him. Arthur lifts his hand and taps twice. Richard cannot hear it, but he knows the rhythm now. "Yes." Margaret clears her throat. The video still shows her assisting with the signature. Arthur turns his head toward her with open disgust. Richard says, "It shows my father asking." Margaret's voice grows smooth. "Sir, your father may have asked," because she had already encouraged him before the recording began. Paul shifts in his chair but says nothing. Richard notices. "What is it?" Paul's face tightens. "Sir, there are cameras in the hallway too." Margaret speaks quickly. "That is unnecessary. We already know she was in the study." Richard's eyes stay on Paul. "Pull the hallway." Paul opens another file. The hallway footage shows Annie approaching the study with a tea tray. No papers in her hands. No folder. No pen. She enters, carrying only tea. Richard's jaw works once. Paul advances the footage. A few minutes later, Margaret appears at the far end of the hallway. She pauses near the half-open door. She does not go in. She does not call out. She does not check on Arthur. She raises her phone and records from the hallway. Margaret watches herself on the screen and says nothing. Paul continues. The footage shows Margaret stepping back, ending the video, and immediately making a phone call. Her posture changes. She holds one hand to her chest, turns away from the study, and speaks with urgency. Richard looks at her. "That was your call to me." Margaret lifts her chin. "Yes, because I was concerned. You didn't go inside. I did not want to startle your father. You didn't ask what the papers were. I believe there was no time. You didn't hear what Annie said." Margaret's eyes harden for the first time. "I saw enough to know that girl had crossed a line." Arthur's voice comes from the wheelchair, rough and low. "No. You hated her." The words hang in the small room. Margaret looks offended, but fear is beginning to show beneath it. "Mr. Harlan, I have served your family for over 20 years. Arthur replies, "Not served, ruled." Richard turns slowly toward his father. Arthur is tired, but he is not confused. His eyes are sharp, full of years of things he has noticed, while others assumed he was fading. Richard asks, "Dad, did Margaret mistreat Annie before today?" Arthur taps twice. Richard's face changes. Margaret says, "That is absurd. I held staff to standards." Arthur points toward the monitor. "Lila." Richard looks at Paul. "Get Mrs. Lila." Paul rises at once, grateful to leave the room. Margaret takes a step after him. There is no need to involve kitchen staff in family matters. Richard's voice stops her. "Stay." For the first time that day, Margaret obeys without speaking. When Lila comes in, she wipes her hands on her apron and looks from Richard to Arthur to Margaret. She is careful, but the fear in Annie's face has not left her mind. Richard asks, "Has Margaret been unfair to Annie?" Lila looks down. Margaret says, "Lila, think carefully before you answer." Arthur strikes the armrest. Richard says, "Margaret, enough." Lila lifts her eyes. "Yes, sir." Margaret inhales sharply. Lila continues. Quieter but steady. "Annie worked hard. She never talked back. Mrs. Bell blamed her for things she didn't do. A chipped glass. A missing towel. Flowers moved from one room to another. Small things, but always Annie." Richard listens without moving. "She also said things," Lila adds. "What things?" Lila hesitates. then looks at Arthur, who gives one slow nod. She called Annie that girl from the back door. Said she was getting above herself. Said Mr. Harlan was too fond of her, and that girls like Annie learn fast around old men with money. Richard's face goes pale. Margaret snaps. That is a filthy lie. Lila turns to her. No, ma'am. The lie is what you did to that girl today. No one speaks. Richard looks at the screen again. The paused image shows Annie helping Arthur sign, her body tense with caution, his hand moving by his own will. Behind that image, Richard now hears Annie's broken voice. I didn't come here for your money. He closes his eyes. Arthur says, find her. Richard opens them. Margaret quickly steps forward. Sir, I advise against that. She may already be speaking to people. She may try to twist this into something damaging for the family. Richard looks at her, and this time there is no trust left in his face. You are dismissed from this room. Margaret stiffens. Mr. Harlan. Now, she looks at Arthur, expecting some weakness there. She finds none. Then she leaves, slow and rigid, her control slipping with every step. When the door closes, Richard stands very still. The room hums with the monitor, the recorded truth glowing in front of him. Paul clears his throat. Sir, should I save the footage? Richard's voice is low. Save all of it. Make copies. Send one to Mr. Price. Yes, sir. Arthur reaches for Richard's sleeve. His fingers barely catch the fabric. Richard looks down. Arthur's eyes are wet. You threw money. Richard flinches. I know. At her. Richard nods once, unable to speak. Arthur's grip weakens, but his voice grows clearer through the anger. She cried, because of you. Richard turns away, but there is nowhere to hide in the small security room. Not from the footage, not from his father, not from himself. He reaches for his phone. Arthur stops him with one word. No. Richard looks back. Dad, I need to call her. Arthur shakes his head. Go. Richard understands. A phone call is too easy. A man can apologize over a phone and still remain protected by distance. Annie had been humiliated in person. Richard must face her, in person. He looks at Paul. Where does Annie live? Paul hesitates. I can get the address from staff records, sir. Richard nods. Do it. Arthur's hand slips from Richard's sleeve. He looks toward the monitor again, where Annie remains frozen in the frame, careful and innocent. Condemned by a few seconds of truth cut away from its meaning. Richard's voice is barely above a breath. What have I done? Arthur answers without pity. What you believed. Richard walks out of the security room with Annie's address written on a slip of paper, but the numbers blur in his hand. He has read contracts worth more than some towns, reviewed land titles thicker than Bibles, and signed orders that moved hundreds of workers in a single morning. Yet this small address on the west side of Charleston feels heavier than any document he has ever held. Arthur waits in the hallway while Paul brings the car around. Richard kneels slightly to face him, but Arthur does not give him comfort. I'll bring her back, Richard says. Arthur's eyes narrow. Ask, he says. Richard lowers his gaze. I'll ask. Arthur's hand rests on the arm of his wheelchair, still shaking from the morning. Richard reaches toward it, then stops. For the first time, he understands that not every hand has the right to touch just because it wants forgiveness. Arthur sees the hesitation and lets his fingers move closer. Richard takes them carefully. I'm sorry, Dad. Arthur studies him for a long moment. Not enough. I know. No, Arthur says, his voice rough. You don't. Not yet. Richard swallows. That is the last thing his father says before Paul opens the front door and the heat of the afternoon rolls into the hall. Richard drives himself. He refuses the driver because Arthur told him to go, and somehow being driven there feels like hiding behind the life that made him this way. The city changes outside his windshield. The wide lawns and old gates give way to gas stations, small churches, laundromats, bus stops, and brick apartment buildings, with paint peeling near the stairs. He passes a grocery store with hand-painted signs, a barber shop with two men talking out front, a church board announcing Sunday service, and a food pantry. He wonders how many times Annie has ridden past these places before dawn to reach his house. He wonders whether she sat on the bus in that gray uniform, holding her little suitcase on her knees, hoping no one at the mansion would find another reason to blame her for something she had not done. His phone rings. Margaret. He lets it ring. It rings again. This time he answers through the car speaker, but he says nothing. Mr. Harlan, Margaret begins, her voice soft and injured. I hope you understand I acted only out of loyalty. I have devoted my life to your family. I fear you are being moved by guilt now, and guilt can be dangerous. Richard keeps his eyes on the road. You lied. I reported what I saw. You reported what you wanted me to believe. A pause. Sir, girls like Annie know how to look innocent. I have seen it before. Richard's hands tighten on the wheel. Do not say another word about her. Margaret exhales as if wounded. After everything I have done for this house, you mistook control for service. His own words surprise him because they sound like his father. Margaret says his name again, but he ends the call. The silence after that is not peaceful. It fills with Annie's face, wet with tears, and the sound of his own voice throwing shame at her. Girls like you. The words return again and again. He tries to tell himself he was scared for his father. He tries to tell himself any son would have reacted, but the excuses collapse under one truth. He believed the worst because the worst fit too easily into a story he had never questioned. He reaches Annie's apartment building just after noon. It is a 2-story brick building beside a narrow parking lot. Laundry hangs over one balcony rail. A woman carries grocery bags up the stairs. Someone has placed a pot of red geraniums near the entrance, the flowers bright against cracked concrete. Richard parks his black sedan near the curb. It looks absurd there. Too large, too polished, too expensive. A few people look over, then look away. He steps out with Annie's address in his hand and suddenly feels the weight of his suit, his watch, his shoes, all the things that usually announce power before he speaks. Annie is sitting on the second step outside the building with her suitcase beside her. The broken wheel is turned at an angle. Her gray uniform is still on, but her apron is folded in her lap. Her eyes are swollen. She holds her nursing notebook against her chest like a shield. Beside her sits Clara Carter, her mother. Clara wears a work shirt from the laundromat and tired shoes. Her face is calm in the way people become calm when anger has gone too deep for shouting. Annie sees Richard first. Her body stiffens. Clara follows her daughter's gaze and stands. Richard stops a few feet away. For once, no one moves toward him. No one opens a door. No one calls him sir with respect. He has to stand there and feel unwelcome. Clara speaks first. You must be Mr. Harlan. Yes, ma'am. The word ma'am leaves his mouth naturally, but it does not help him. Clara looks him over. My daughter came home with mud on her sweater, tears on her face, and your money's still on your floor. So whatever you came to say it standing right there. Annie looks down. Mama. No, Clara says softly. You cried enough today. Let him be uncomfortable. Richard accepts it because he deserves worse. Annie, he says, the papers were not inheritance documents. She closes her eyes. They were for the land donation, he continues. My father told me. We checked the security footage. We saw you call the lawyer's office. We saw that he asked you. We saw that you did not force him. Annie opens her eyes. They are full of hurt, not surprise. I told you that. I know. No, she says, her voice trembling. You know it now. I told you then. Richard has no answer. Clara steps closer. Did you throw money at my child? Richard's throat tightens. Yes. Did you call her the kind of girl who would steal from an old man? He looks at Annie. Her face crumples again, and she turns away, as if the memory itself is too much to hold in front of him. Yes, Richard says. Clara's voice stays low. And now you came here because a camera told you what her word should have been enough to make you check. Richard lowers his head. Yes. Annie wipes her cheek quickly, angry at her own tears. Why did you believe her so fast? Richard looks up. Margaret? No, Annie says. The lie. Why did the lie sound so easy to believe? The question lands harder than any accusation. Richard looks at the cracked concrete beneath his shoes. Because I was afraid, he says. Annie shakes her head. No. You were angry. You were proud. And you looked at me like I was already guilty before I said anything. Richard breathes in slowly. You're right. She almost laughs, but it breaks into a sob. I begged you to read the papers. I know. I asked you to ask him. I know. You threw money at me. His eyes close for a second. I know. You made me feel like everything good I ever did for your father was dirty. Richard looks at her then. and the shame in him has nowhere left to hide. I am sorry. Annie presses the notebook harder to her chest. Sorry doesn't take that moment out of my head. No, Richard says. It doesn't. Clara folds her arms. Then what do you want? Richard looks at Annie, not her mother, because the answer belongs to her. My father wants to see you. He asked me to come, not call. He told me to ask, not bring. So I'm asking, will you come back and let him see you? Annie's tears fall again. Is he all right? He's upset. He's tired. But he's clear, and he knows you did nothing wrong. Her mouth trembles. He tried to tell you. Yes. You wouldn't let him? No, Richard says. I wouldn't. Annie looks away toward the street. A bus passes at the corner. Brakes sighing. Doors opening for people who carry their lives in grocery bags and work uniforms. She watches it as if it might save her from deciding. Clara sits beside her again and takes her hand. Baby, you don't owe that house another step. I know, Annie whispers. Richard waits. Waiting is new to him. Usually silence makes him fill it with instructions. Now he lets it stand. Because it belongs to Annie. After a long moment, she looks back at him. I'm not going through the back door. Richard answers at once. No, you won't. I'm not putting that uniform back on today. You don't have to. And I'm not going back for you. Richard nods. I understand. Annie's voice breaks. I'm going because he reached for me, and nobody let me say goodbye. Richard's eyes burn, but he does not ask for pity. Clara stands. I'm coming too. Of course, Richard says. Annie rises slowly, wiping her face with the heel of her hand. Richard reaches for the suitcase, then stops and looks at her. May I? She studies him for a second, then nods. He picks up the broken suitcase. It is lighter than he expects, and that shames him too. So little had been thrown out of his house. So much had been taken from her. As they walk toward the car, Annie keeps her notebook in her arms. Richard opens the rear door. Clara gets in first. Annie pauses before entering and looks at him. You can apologize to me, she says, but don't ask me to make you feel better. Richard holds the door and nods. I won't. Annie gets into the car. Richard closes the door gently, then stands for a moment on the curb with her damaged suitcase in his hand. For the first time that day, he understands that bringing Annie back will not erase what he has done. It will only force him to face it where it happened. The drive back to the Harlan estate is quiet, in a way Richard has never known quiet before. He is used to silence in expensive cars, the kind made by thick glass, soft leather, and engines built not to be heard. This silence is different. It sits in the back seat with Annie and Clara. It breathes through every word not spoken. Richard keeps both hands on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, he sees Annie turn slightly toward the window, her nursing notebook held against her chest. Her face is still wet. She wipes it once, then looks embarrassed that he might have seen. Clara notices too and takes a tissue from her purse, pressing it gently into her daughter's hand. Don't hide your tears from him, Clara says. He needs to know what they cost. Annie does not answer. She only nods. Richard swallows. Mrs. Carter, you're right. Clara looks at the back of his head. I didn't ask if I was. The words are calm, but they land hard. Richard accepts them. He has spent his life surrounded by people who soften the truth before giving it to him. Clara does not. Annie finally speaks, her voice small. Did Mr. Harlan eat anything? Richard glances at the mirror. No. Not since you left. Her eyes fill again. He needs soup when he's upset. Not coffee. Coffee makes his hands worse. Richard has no reply. He did not know that. Margaret probably knew. The nurse might have known. But Annie says it like it matters. Like Arthur's shaking hands are not an inconvenience, but a language. I'll have Lila make soup, he says. Annie looks down. Please don't say it like an order. Richard pauses. How should I say it? Ask Mrs. Lila if she can make it. She's been on her feet since early morning. Clara turns her head toward Annie, her expression softening with pride and pain at the same time. Even after being humiliated, Annie is thinking about the tired cook in the kitchen. Richard nods slowly. All right, I'll ask. They reach the estate gates. Paul sees the car and opens them, but his face changes when he recognizes Annie in the back seat. Relief crosses him before caution returns. At the front drive, Annie stiffens. Richard pulls up to the main entrance and stops. For a moment, no one moves. Annie looks toward the side of the house, toward the service path she has used every day. Richard sees it and feels a fresh cut of shame. The mansion has many doors, but the house has taught people which ones they are allowed to use. He steps out and opens Clara's door first. Then he opens Annie's. Annie remains seated. Richard waits. She looks at the white columns, the wide steps, the brass handle on the front door. I cleaned that handle yesterday, Richard says. Then today you use it. Annie's lips tremble. As what? Richard understands the question. Not as maid. Not as accused. Not as someone dragged back to repair his conscience. As my father's guest, he says. Clara steps beside her daughter. And as my daughter, Richard lowers his head. Yes, ma'am. Annie gets out, holding her notebook. Richard reaches for the suitcase in the trunk, but Clara stops him with a look. Leave it in the car, she says. She's not moving back in. Annie looks grateful. Richard closes the trunk without argument. The front door opens before they reach the steps. Margaret stands inside the foyer. She is dressed as neatly as before, but her face has lost its smooth confidence. She looks at Annie, then at Clara, then at Richard. Mr. Harlan, Margaret says, may I speak with you privately before this goes any further? Richard does not stop walking. No, sir, I truly believe you are making a mistake. He turns at the threshold. I made the mistake when I listened to you without checking the truth. Margaret's mouth tightens. I protected this family. Clara looks at her. From what? A crying girl with a notebook? Margaret's eyes flash. This is a private household matter. Clara steps forward, steady and unafraid. Not after you dragged my child's name through it. Annie grips Clara's sleeve. Mama. No, baby. Let grown people hear grown truth. Richard opens the door wider and steps aside. Annie looks at the entrance. She takes one breath, then another. Her foot touches the front hall. Inside, several staff members have gathered near the staircase and kitchen corridor. Beth is there, pale and nervous. Marcy stands behind her, no longer eager. Lila wipes her hands on her apron, tears already in her eyes. Paul comes in quietly from behind. The foyer goes still as Annie enters. She hears the silence and almost turns back. Richard notices. You don't owe anyone your courage, he says quietly. Annie looks at him, surprised by the sentence, then keeps walking. Arthur waits at the far end of the foyer in his wheelchair. Richard must have asked Paul to bring him there before leaving. Or perhaps Arthur insisted. His shoulders are tired, but his eyes are alive with urgency. The moment he sees Annie, he lifts his shaking hand. Annie, it is barely more than a breath, but it reaches her. She breaks. The notebook slips from her arms and lands against her hip. She hurries toward him, then stops halfway, looking at Richard as if remembering his command from earlier. You don't touch him again. Richard's face tightens with shame. Go to him, he says. Annie kneels beside Arthur's chair. Mr. Harlan. Arthur takes her hand with effort. His fingers close weakly around hers. She hurt? He asks, looking at Richard. Annie shakes her head through tears. I'm okay. Clara speaks from behind her. No, you are not. Arthur looks at Clara, and his face folds with sorrow. I'm sorry, he says. Clara's anger softens at once. She steps closer. You have nothing to apologize for, Mr. Harlan. Arthur looks at Annie again. His thumb moves once over the back of her hand, a small apology his body can still make. Richard stands before the staff, Margaret near one side of the foyer. His voice is low at first. Everyone here needs to hear this. Margaret tries to interrupt. Sir, perhaps this should be handled with discretion. Richard turns to her. Discretion is what people ask for when they want the truth to enter through the back door. No one speaks. Richard faces the staff again. Annie Carter did not force my father to sign anything. She did not take money from him. She did not ask for money. The documents were a public land conservation donation prepared by Daniel Price at my father's request. Annie called the lawyer's office before helping him steady his hand. We have the security footage. Beth covers her mouth. Marcy looks down. Lila whispers, thank God. Richard continues. And now the words cost him more. I accused her without reading the papers. I threw money at her feet. I let anger and prejudice speak for me. I was wrong. Annie's shoulders shake, but she does not look away. Margaret's face hardens. Sir, I must object to the word prejudice. That is a serious accusation against yourself and this household. Richard turns to her. It is serious. That is why I am saying it. Margaret looks around, realizing the room is no longer hers. I reported a suspicious act, she says. Any responsible housekeeper would have done the same. Richard nods once. A responsible housekeeper would have entered the room and asked my father what he wanted. Arthur taps twice on the armrest. Richard looks at him. Yes. Margaret's voice rises. He is not always clear. Arthur's eyes sharpen. Clear. Enough. Lila steps forward. Mrs. Bell, you knew Annie was good to him. Margaret snaps. Good? She overstepped. Beth speaks suddenly, voice trembling. You told us she was trying to get in the will. Margaret turns on her. I said no such thing. Marcy, pale now, says, you did. In the linen hall. You said girls like her learn fast around lonely old men. Annie closes her eyes as if each repeated phrase wounds her again. Clara puts a hand on Annie's shoulder. Richard looks at Margaret. Pack your things. Margaret freezes. Excuse me? You are dismissed. The words strike the foyer. Margaret's face goes white, then red. After 20 years? After today, Richard says, and after every day that led to today. You will regret this. Richard looks toward Annie, still kneeling beside Arthur, still crying quietly over a wound money cannot close. I already regret enough. Margaret stands there a moment longer, waiting for someone to defend her. No one does. Not Beth, not Marcy, not Paul, not Lila, not Richard, and certainly not Arthur. She turns and walks toward the service hall, the same way she forced Annie out earlier, only now no one follows her. Arthur squeezes Annie's hand. Stay? He asks. Annie wipes her cheek. Just for a little while. Richard hears the limit and respects it. Lila clears her throat. Mr. Harlan, would you like me to make soup for your father? Richard almost gives an order, then catches himself. Mrs. Lila, if you're able, would you make the soup he likes? Lila gives Annie a small look, as if she knows who taught him that. I'd be glad to, she says. The foyer begins to breathe again. Staff drift away quietly, shaken by what they have witnessed. Clara helps Annie stand, but Arthur does not release her hand right away. Richard steps closer, stopping at a careful distance. Annie, he says, I am sorry. Not because I was caught being wrong. Because I was wrong when you were begging me to listen. Annie looks at him. Her eyes are red, her face tired, her voice thin. I heard your apology. Richard nods. I know that isn't forgiveness. No, she says, it isn't. Arthur taps once, then twice, frustrated by his own weakness. Annie bends toward him. What is it, sir? Arthur looks at Richard. Learn, he says. Richard lowers his head. I will. Arthur closes his eyes for a moment, still holding Annie's hand, while the front door remains open behind them, letting afternoon light into a house that has spent too long deciding who was allowed to walk through it. Arthur is taken back to his study because he refuses to rest anywhere else. Richard pushes the wheelchair himself, moving slower than he ever has in his own house. Annie walks beside Clara a few steps behind them, her fingers still curled around the nursing notebook, though she does not seem to know she is holding it. The study looks worse than before. The money has been gathered from the floor and placed on the corner of the desk, but the sight of it still makes Annie's face tighten. The documents lie in a neat stack now, saved from Richard's anger by Paul's careful hands. The pen rests beside them, uncapped, the ink drying at the tip. Arthur points toward the window. Richard turns the chair so his father can see the trees. Like this? Arthur taps twice. Annie hears it and wipes her face quickly. The sound is so familiar it hurts. Twice for yes. Twice for honey. Twice for the yellow flowers. Twice when she asked if the curtains were right. It is such a small sound, but it is the first language in that house that ever trusted her. Lila brings soup a little later, carrying the bowl on a tray with a folded napkin and a glass of water. She sets it on the side table, then looks at Annie. I made it the way you told me last week, Lila says. Not too much salt. Annie gives a weak smile. Thank you, Mrs. Lila. Richard looks from one woman to the other. You knew how he liked it? Lila nods. Annie noticed. Your father coughs when it's too salty. Richard turns toward Arthur. I didn't know that. Arthur does not comfort him. No. Clara stands near the door, arms folded. watching every movement in the room. She is not impressed by the house, the furniture, or Richard's softened voice. Her daughter has been hurt there. Nothing in the room is beautiful enough to cover that. Annie steps toward the tray, then stops. I shouldn't. Arthur's head turns. Richard says, Annie, you don't have to do anything. I know, she says, but he needs to eat before it gets cold. Clara speaks gently. Baby, you can care about him without becoming responsible for fixing what they broke. Annie's eyes fill again. I know, Mama. Arthur's fingers move on the armrest. Tap, tap. Annie looks at him. You want me to help? Tap, tap. Richard steps back. Only if you want to. Annie hesitates, then picks up the spoon. Her hand is not steady. She stirs the soup once and blows on it softly. The room watches her, and that makes her shrink into herself. Please don't all look at me, she says. Richard turns away first. Clara remains near her but gives her space. Lila lowers her eyes. Arthur waits. Annie holds the spoon near Arthur. Small sip, Mr. Harlan. He takes it slowly. Some spills at the corner of his mouth. Annie reaches for the napkin, then pauses and looks at Richard. Richard understands. May she? Arthur taps twice. Only then does Annie wipe his chin. Her tears fall again, quieter now. Arthur sees them, his own eyes wet. Sorry, he says. Annie shakes her head. No, sir, you didn't do this. Arthur looks toward Richard. Richard absorbs that without protest. I did. The words sit in the room. Lila leaves to give them privacy. Clara stays because Annie needs one person there who belongs to her. Richard moves to the desk and picks up the stack of land documents. He looks at them as if they might burn his hands. Dad, he says, Daniel is on his way. He'll confirm everything. Then we'll file it. Arthur closes his eyes, relieved. Richard continues, I won't stop it. Arthur opens his eyes again. Shouldn't have tried. Richard nods. You're right. Annie lowers the spoon back into the bowl. Mr. Harlan, were these the papers for the woods? Arthur taps twice. She looks toward the window. The place behind the lake? Tap. Richard turns to her. He told you about it? A little, Annie says. Not much. He gets tired, but he told me Mrs. Harlan liked the trail. Arthur's face softens at his wife's name. Annie continues, her voice unsteady. He said people should be able to walk there, not just people with gate codes. Clara looks at Arthur with new respect. Richard looks at the papers again. He never said it to me that way. Arthur's answer is immediate. You didn't ask. Richard lowers the documents. Annie flinches when the study door opens. Paul steps in, careful and quiet. Mr. Harlan, Mr. Price is here. Richard nods. Bring him in. Daniel Price enters a moment later, carrying a leather folder and wearing the kind of expression lawyers wear when trouble has already arrived before them. He greets Arthur first, not Richard. Arthur, he says, stepping close. Are you all right? Arthur gives one tired nod. Daniel turns to Richard. I got the footage Paul sent. I also reviewed the call log from my office. Annie Carter called at 9:23 this morning. My assistant explained the procedure. Everything she did was appropriate. Annie looks down at the floor, crying again, but this time from the strange pain of being believed too late. Daniel faces her. Miss Carter, I owe you an apology as well. My office should have insisted a witness from our side be present. We put you in a difficult position. Annie shakes her head quickly. No, sir. I just wanted to do it right. You did, Daniel says, very carefully. Richard hears the words and feels their weight. Carefully. Not greedily. Not secretly. Carefully. Daniel sets the folder on the desk. Arthur has been working on this donation for months. He was clear about the land, the terms, and the reason. This is not an inheritance document. It does not benefit Miss Carter in any way. Clara gives Richard a hard look. Say that again. Daniel understands. The documents do not give Annie Carter money, land, property, shares, or any legal benefit. Annie's shoulders shake once. She presses her lips together, trying to hold back another sob. Richard turns toward her. I should have read them. Annie's voice is small. Yes, I should have asked him. Yes, I should have asked you. She looks at him then. You should have believed I deserved a question before an accusation. Richard has no defense. Yes. Arthur taps twice, slow and firm. Daniel begins reviewing the pages with Arthur, confirming each section. Richard notices how Daniel speaks to his father directly, waiting for his answers, not rushing him. Annie had done the same. Richard had not. When Daniel reaches the signature page, he pauses. The signature is valid. But given what happened today, I recommend we complete an additional confirmation on video. Arthur can state, as clearly as he is able, that the donation is voluntary. Arthur nods. Richard asks, "Now?" Arthur taps twice. Daniel sets up his phone on the desk. "Arthur, I'll ask simple questions. Take your time." Arthur straightens as much as his body allows. Daniel begins. "Is it your wish to donate the 40 acres behind the Harlan estate to Low Country Public Land Trust?" Arthur breathes in. "Yes." "Did Annie Carter force you, pressure you, or ask you for anything in return?" Arthur's face tightens with anger. "No." Annie breaks into tears again, covering her mouth. Clara pulls her close. Daniel continues gently. "Did you ask Annie to steady your hand because your hand was shaking?" "Yes." "Did she refuse at first because she was afraid it might be improper?" Arthur taps twice, then forces the word out. "Yes." Richard looks away. The truth is no longer lying quietly in papers or cameras. It is coming from his father's own mouth, piece by piece. And every piece makes Richard smaller. Daniel stops the recording. "That should protect the donation and Miss Carter." Annie whispers, "Thank you." Arthur reaches for her hand again. This time Richard does not move between them. Annie takes it carefully. Arthur looks at his son. "Money," he says. Richard follows his gaze to the cash on the desk. His stomach turns. He picks it up slowly. For a moment, Annie stiffens, as if afraid he will repeat the insult. Instead, Richard walks to the fireplace and places the bills in a small brass box near the mantel. "I don't know what to do with it," he says. Clara answers, "Start by never using it to spit on someone again." Richard closes the box. "I won't." Arthur leans back, exhausted, but his eyes stay on Richard. "Not words," he says. Richard nods. "I know. Actions." Annie wipes her face and stands. "Mr. Harlan, I should go home." Arthur's fingers tighten around hers. Richard says, "We can drive you." Clara answers before Annie can. "We came in your car. We can leave in it. That doesn't mean anything is fixed." "I understand." Annie gently releases Arthur's hand. "I'll come see you again if my mother says it's all right, and if I want to." Arthur taps once, then twice, as if he accepts the condition. Richard walks them to the front door. This time no staff gather. No one blocks Annie. No one tells her which exit to use. At the threshold, Annie turns back toward the study. "Please make sure he eats the rest of the soup." Richard says, "I will ask him if he wants more." She looks at him, tired but listening. "That's better," she says. Then she steps outside with Clara, leaving Richard in the doorway of his own house, holding nothing but the knowledge that learning respect had begun with watching a girl he had wronged teach it to him. Richard remains at the front door until Annie and Clara are gone from the drive. Paul takes them home in one of the estate cars because Richard asks first and Clara accepts only after Annie says Arthur looks too tired for them to wait on a bus. Even that small agreement feels fragile, as if one wrong word could break it. When the car disappears beyond the gate, Richard closes the door and stands in the foyer. The house is too quiet, not peaceful. Accusing. Beth and Marcy have returned to work, but their voices are low now, stripped of the excitement they had carried earlier. Lila moves between the kitchen and Arthur's study with soup and warm tea. Paul has gone back to the security room to copy the footage. Margaret is somewhere in the servants' wing, packing under supervision, though Richard has not yet found the strength to face her again. He turns toward the study. Arthur sits by the window with the bowl of soup on a tray beside him. He has eaten a little, not enough, but more than Richard expected. The old man's eyes remain on the trees beyond the lawn. Richard enters quietly. "Would you like more soup?" Arthur taps once. Richard waits. "Maybe?" Arthur gives the smallest nod. Richard almost reaches for the bowl, then stops. "Would you like me to warm it first?" Arthur taps twice. Richard picks up the bowl. Such a simple thing, and he has to think his way through it like a man learning a language late in life. Annie would have known without making it complicated. She would have noticed the way Arthur's mouth tightened at cold soup, the way his fingers moved when he wanted the cup closer, the way his shoulders sank when people spoke over him. Richard carries the bowl to the kitchen himself. Lila sees him and reaches for it. "I can do that, sir." He holds it out, then pauses. "If you're able, would you warm this for my father?" Lila studies him for half a second. "Yes, sir." He hears Annie's voice in his head. "Please don't say it like an order." The shame rises again. But this time he lets it stay. Shame, he is beginning to understand, can either poison a man or teach him where the wound is. Lila sets the soup on the stove. "She's a good girl." Richard nods. "I know that now." Lila does not spare him. "She was a good girl this morning too." He looks down. "Yes." Marcy appears at the kitchen entrance with a stack of plates. When she sees Richard, she freezes. "Mr. Harlan." He turns. "Marcy." Her face reddens. "I shouldn't have said what I said in the hall." "No," Richard says. "You shouldn't have." She looks close to tears. "Mrs. Bell told us things. I believed her." Richard thinks of how easy that sentence is. "I believed her." As if belief is something that happens to a person, not something a person chooses. He says, "You should apologize to Annie if she allows it." Marcy nods quickly. "Yes, sir." "And don't make her forgiveness your goal," he adds, surprising himself again. "Make honesty your habit." Lila looks at him, then back at the soup, saying nothing. Beth comes in next, carrying clean towels. Her eyes are swollen. "Sir, is Annie coming back?" Richard answers carefully. "That will be her decision." Beth nods. "I didn't defend her." Richard looks at her. "Neither did I." That silences the room more than any rebuke. After Arthur eats a few more spoonfuls, Daniel Price returns to the study with a printed copy of the confirmation statement. He sits across from Arthur, not beside Richard, and speaks slowly. "I'll file the documents tomorrow morning. The Land Trust Board can accept the donation within the week if there are no objections." Richard stands near the mantel. "There won't be." Daniel looks at him over his glasses. "Your development committee may disagree." "They can disagree. Your company has preliminary projections tied to that parcel." Richard knows. 40 acres of old trees and lakefront land near Charleston can become private homes. A wellness retreat. Rental cottages. A gated community with tasteful branding and high returns. He has seen the numbers. He approved some of them. He has been looking at his mother's trees as future revenue for years. Arthur watches him. Richard says, "I won't fight the donation." Arthur's hand shifts on the armrest. Tap, tap. Daniel closes his folder. "Then I'll proceed." When the lawyer leaves, Richard remains in the study with his father. The brass box with the money sits near the mantel. He cannot stop seeing it. "Dad," he says, "what do you want done about Margaret?" Arthur does not answer at once. His eyes stay on the window. "Gone," he says finally. "She is." Arthur turns his head. "No, more. Back door." Richard frowns. "What?" Arthur breathes hard, gathering the words. "Staff. Door." Richard looks toward the hallway. "You want the service entrance closed?" Arthur shakes his head, frustrated by the limits of language. "Choice." Richard understands slowly. "You don't want people forced to use it." Arthur taps twice. Richard sits down. "That's what Annie meant by the front door." Arthur's eyes sharpen. "You learned? Not enough." Arthur accepts that with a tired blink. Richard spends the next hour going through household policies with Daniel by phone. It feels almost absurd. Reducing moral failure to rules. But rules shape how people are treated when no one powerful is watching. He ends the mandatory service door policy. He orders written procedures for complaints against staff. No accusation can lead to dismissal without review. No personal belongings can be searched without documented cause and consent or legal requirement. Staff can report mistreatment directly to Daniel's office for the next 6 months. Daniel says, "That is a start." Richard hears the restraint in that phrase. Only a start. Yes. In the late afternoon, Richard walks to the servants' wing. Margaret's room is neat, of course. 2 suitcases stand by the door. Margaret sits in a chair with her purse in her lap. She rises when he enters, as if formality might rebuild her authority. "Mr. Harlan, your final pay will be sent. Daniel will handle the paperwork." Her lips press together. "After 20 years, I deserve more than paperwork. You deserved a hearing. You got one. Annie didn't. Margaret's face hardens. You are letting that girl turn you against people who have been loyal. Richard feels the old reflex stir, the one that once trusted her polished certainty. It dies quickly. She did not turn me against you. The footage did. My father did. Your own words did. I protected your father from a girl who had no business touching family documents. My father asked for help. He is not what he was. Richard's voice lowers. He is still a man. Margaret looks away. And Annie is still a person, Richard says. That was the part this house forgot. Margaret gives a short, bitter laugh. You think changing doors and giving speeches will fix what you are? Richard takes that without flinching. No. But pretending I did nothing would make sure I stay that way. For the first time, Margaret has no answer. Paul escorts her out through the side entrance because that is where her car waits. Richard watches from the hallway, and the irony cuts at him. Margaret leaves through the same path she guarded like a boarder. She does not look back. That evening, Richard returns to Arthur's study with 2 cups of tea. One has honey because Lila told him to add it only after the water cools a little. He places it near Arthur's left hand. Would you like to hold it? Arthur looks at the cup, then at Richard. Richard adds, I'll steady it if you want. You move. Arthur's face changes slightly. A small recognition. A lesson repeated. Tap, tap. Richard places his hand beneath Arthur's wrist the way Annie did. Not over, not controlling, supporting. Arthur lifts the cup an inch. Tea trembles near the rim. Richard's instinct is to take over, but he does not. A few drops fall onto the napkin. Arthur drinks. When the cup returns to the tray, Richard lets out a breath he did not know he was holding. Arthur looks at him. Hard? He asks. Richard gives a small, sad laugh. Letting you try? Arthur taps twice. Yes, Richard says. It's hard. Arthur closes his eyes, tired but calmer. The room darkens as evening settles over the trees. Richard sits beside him without reaching for his phone. There are calls waiting. Angry board members. Contracts. Explanations to give. For once, he lets them wait. After a long silence, Arthur speaks. Annie, tomorrow? Richard looks at his father. I don't know if she'll come. Arthur's eyes open. Richard says, I can ask. Arthur taps twice. Richard nods. I'll ask. Then he sits there, listening to the house breathe differently without Margaret's footsteps in the hall, without Annie's quiet work in the next room, without the easy lie that money can clean what pride has dirtied. For the first time, Richard understands that tomorrow's apology will not be a speech. It will be a choice, repeated, again and again, until the house itself learns how to open its doors. The next morning begins without Margaret's voice in the halls. For years, Richard had not noticed how much of the house moved around her commands. Breakfast trays had arrived before he asked. Doors had opened before he reached them. Staff had stepped aside before his shoes touched the floor. He had mistaken that kind of order for peace. Now, without Margaret, the house feels uncertain, but not broken. It feels like people are breathing before they speak. Richard wakes before 6 and walks to the kitchen. Lila is already there, measuring oatmeal into a pot while coffee brews beside her. She looks up, surprised to see him without a suit jacket, without a phone in his hand, without a demand ready. Morning, Mr. Harlan. Good morning, Mrs. Lila. He stops near the counter. May I help with anything? Lila almost laughs, then sees he is serious. You can pour your father's tea. Let it sit a minute before the honey. Richard nods. Annie told me coffee makes his hands worse. She's right. He opens a cabinet, then pauses. Which cup? The blue one with the crack near the handle. He likes that one. Richard finds it. The crack is small, repaired long ago, almost invisible if a man is not looking. He turns the cup in his hand and wonders how many things in his father's life have been there in plain sight while he walked past them. Paul enters from the service hall carrying a folder. Sir, Mr. Price sent the copies. Footage, call log, statement, and the land trust documents. Richard takes the folder. Thank you. Paul hesitates. Sir, I should have helped Annie when Mrs. Bell threw her suitcase out. Richard looks at him. Why didn't you? Paul's face reddens. I was afraid of losing my job. Richard hears no excuse in it, only truth. That fear was built into this house. I helped build it. Paul lowers his eyes. Richard says, if Annie comes today, apologize only if she wants to hear it. Do not corner her with your guilt. Yes, sir. Arthur is awake when Richard carries the tea into the study. The old man is by the window, wrapped in a light blanket, his eyes on the trees. Richard places the cup within reach. Blue cup, he says. Arthur looks at it, then at him. Tap, tap. Richard sits beside him. I'm going to call Annie. Arthur's hand shifts. Tap, tap. Richard dials Clara's number, not Annie's. He had asked for permission the night before to contact Clara first. The phone rings 3 times. Clara answers. Mr. Harlan. Mrs. Carter. Good morning. That depends on why you're calling. Richard looks at Arthur. My father would like to know if Annie is willing to visit today. Only if she wants to. No work, no uniform, no pressure. There is silence on the line. Then Clara says, she didn't sleep much. Richard closes his eyes briefly. I'm sorry. I know you are. That does not make sleep come easier. No, Mom. He hears movement, then muffled voices. Clara is speaking to Annie, not covering the phone fully. Richard does not try to listen, but Annie's voice reaches him anyway. Quiet and tired. Is he asking or is his son asking? Clara returns. She wants to know if Arthur is asking. Richard holds the phone toward Arthur. Dad? Arthur leans closer. His voice is weak but clear enough. Annie, please. On the other end, there is no answer for several seconds. Then Annie speaks, and Richard can hear tears in the thinness of her voice. I'll come for a little while. Richard exhales. Thank you. Clara comes back on the line. We will come in my car. We don't need yours. Of course. And she walks in the front again. Yes, ma'am. And if anyone looks at her wrong, we leave. Richard looks around the study, at the papers, the cup, the empty place where yesterday's money had been. Understood. They arrive just after 9. Clara drives an old sedan with one mismatched door. Richard is waiting at the front steps. Not inside. Arthur waits in the foyer because he insists on being there, despite Richard's concern. Lila stands near the hall with a folded handkerchief in her hands. Beth and Marcy are not gathered like an audience this time. Richard has told the staff not to make Annie walk through another performance. When Annie steps out of the car, she is not in uniform. She wears a simple blouse and dark pants. Her hair is pulled back. Her eyes are still swollen. She holds her nursing notebook again, but lower now, no longer like a shield, more like a reminder of who she is outside the Harlan house. Richard walks down one step, then stops, so she does not feel crowded. Good morning, Annie. She gives a small nod. Mr. Harlan, I'm glad you came. I came for him. I know. Clara comes around the car and stands beside her daughter. All right, baby. Annie walks up the steps. At the door, she pauses again. Richard opens it and steps back. Arthur is waiting inside. The moment he sees her, his face loosens with relief. He raises his hand. Annie. She goes to him, slower than yesterday, as if the house still hurts to walk through. She kneels beside his wheelchair. Good morning, Mr. Harlan. Arthur touches her hand. Sleep? Annie gives a weak laugh that turns almost into a sob. Not much. Arthur's mouth trembles. Me. Too. She lowers her head, and he pats her hand once with shaking fingers. It is clumsy, but it carries more tenderness than a speech. Richard says, would you like to sit in the study or the porch? Annie looks at Arthur. What would you like, sir? Arthur points toward the porch. Richard nods. The porch. They move through the foyer to the side porch facing the oaks. The morning is mild, with wind moving through the Spanish moss. Lila brings tea and biscuits, then looks at Annie. I made extra honey butter. Annie's mouth quivers. Thank you. Lila pauses. I'm sorry I didn't speak louder yesterday. Annie looks down at her hands. You spoke when you could. That doesn't feel like enough. No, Annie says softly, but it's more than some people did. Richard accepts the words because they include him. Arthur looks toward the trees. Daniel Price arrives a few minutes later with final copies for Arthur to review. He greets Annie with respect. Miss Carter, I'm glad you're here. Arthur asked that you be present while we finish the confirmation. Annie looks nervous. Am I supposed to sign something? No, Daniel says gently. Only witness if you choose, and only your name on a witness line, not as part of any transfer. You may decline. Richard adds, no one will ask you to touch a pen unless you want to. Annie's eyes flick to him. She hears the care in the words, but also the memory behind them. I'll witness. For Mr. Harlan, Daniel reviews the final page. Arthur confirms again. The land donation is voluntary. The land goes to public preservation. No private development. No benefit to Annie. Richard listens to every word. This time, he does not hear lost profit first. He hears his father's will. When Daniel places the pen before Arthur, Richard asks, Dad, would you like help holding it? Arthur looks at Annie. Annie says quietly, he asked you. Arthur turns back to Richard and taps twice. Richard sits beside his father. He places his hand under Arthur's wrist, light and careful. Arthur moves the pen. The signature is slow, uneven, but his own. Annie watches with tears in her eyes. When it is done, Arthur looks at her. You see? She nods. Yes, sir, I see. Richard looks at the signature and then at Annie. That is what I should have done yesterday. Help without taking over. Ask without accusing. Wait without deciding for him. Annie says nothing for a while. Then she looks toward the trees. My grandmother used to say justice is not fair just because it finally arrives. Sometimes it comes after it already let you bleed. Arthur closes his eyes as if the sentence has reached him deeply. Richard lowers his head. She was right. Annie wipes her cheek. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I know. I'm saying it because I need you to understand that being cleared is not the same as being unhurt. Richard's voice is quiet. I understand more than I did. Not enough yet. Arthur taps twice. For the first time that morning, Annie almost smiles. Richard sees it and does not claim it as forgiveness. He lets it be what it is, a small sign that truth has entered the house, even if healing is still standing at the door. Daniel leaves the porch with the signed confirmation pages in his folder, promising Arthur he will file them before noon. Richard walks him to the front door, and for once, he does not speak like a man trying to close a deal. He listens as Daniel explains the next steps. Recording the donation, notifying the land trust, preparing a public statement, setting a date for the transfer ceremony. The board will move quickly, Daniel says. They've wanted access to that trail for years. Richard looks toward the side porch where Arthur sits with Annie and Clara. Years? Daniel gives him a careful look. Your father spoke to them before he spoke to you. Richard absorbs that without defending himself, because he thought I'd stop him. Yes. Richard's jaw tightens, but not in anger now. He was probably right. Daniel closes the folder. Being right about a man yesterday does not mean he has to be right about him tomorrow. Richard looks at him. Daniel adds, but tomorrow has to prove itself. After Daniel leaves, Richard returns to the porch. Annie is sitting in a wicker chair near Arthur, hands folded in her lap. Clara sits beside her. Arthur watches the trees as if the signed papers have allowed him to breathe with them. Richard stops at the doorway. Dad, Daniel is filing everything today. Arthur taps twice on the armrest. Annie looks toward the woods. Will people really be allowed to walk there? Richard nods. That is what he wants. Arthur turns to her. Not locked. Annie wipes at her cheek, though she is not crying hard now. Mrs. Harlan would like that, wouldn't she? Arthur's face softens at Louise's name. Richard sits down slowly. He told you about my mother? A little, Annie says. Not much at once. He gets tired, but he told me she liked the lake after rain. He said the water looked silver then. Richard looks at his father. You never told me that. Arthur's answer comes without cruelty, which somehow hurts more. You never sat. Clara looks down at her hands. Annie looks away, not wanting to witness more of a family's private wound, though she is already part of it now. Richard leans back, eyes on the oak trees. When I was younger, my mother used to make me walk that trail after church. I hated it. My shoes got muddy. Mosquitoes ate me alive. She would bring a paper bag with biscuits and peaches, and she'd make me carry it like it was some grand responsibility. Arthur's mouth lifts a little. She'd stop every few minutes to talk to somebody. Richard continues. A groundskeeper, a neighbor, a woman from church. I thought she was wasting time. I wanted to get back inside where it was cool. Arthur looks at him. Richard exhales. I didn't understand that she was teaching me how to see people. Clara says, did you learn? The question is not cruel. It is honest. Richard turns to her. Not then. Annie watches the trees, listening. Richard continues. After she died, I thought keeping the estate meant keeping everything exactly as it was. The land, the house, the name. But I turned it into numbers. I saw acreage, value, potential. I forgot she saw people walking there. Arthur's hand trembles on the armrest. Louise, shared. Richard nods. Yes, she did. Lila comes out with a tray of iced tea and a small plate of biscuits. She asks before setting anything near Arthur. Would you like tea, Mr. Harlan? Arthur taps twice. She places the glass where he can reach it. Then she looks at Annie. Would you like some too? Annie hesitates. The house has trained her not to accept what was not clearly offered. Clara notices. Answer, baby. Annie nods. Yes, please. Lila gives her a glass, then one to Clara, then Richard. It is a small thing, everyone holding the same tea on the same porch, but Richard feels the meaning of it. Yesterday, Annie was dragged through the service hall. Today, she sits where guests sit. It is not enough, but it is not nothing. From inside, Beth appears near the doorway, nervous. Excuse me, she says. Annie? Annie turns, and her body tightens at once. Beth steps onto the porch but keeps her distance. I won't come closer unless you say it's all right. Annie looks at Clara, then back at Beth. It's all right. Beth's voice shakes. I'm sorry. I heard things and I didn't stop them. I knew you were kind to Mr. Harlan. And when people started talking, I let myself be quiet because it was easier. Annie looks down. It's always easier for the person not being accused. Beth's face crumples. I know. Annie says nothing for a moment. Then she says, thank you for saying it. Beth nods, crying now. I'll leave you alone. As Beth goes inside, Richard looks at Annie. You didn't have to comfort her. I wasn't comforting her, Annie says. I was letting her leave with the truth. Clara reaches over and squeezes her daughter's hand. Arthur taps twice, slow and approving. The afternoon settles warm around them. For the first time since the accusation, no one is rushing Annie out of her room. No one is speaking over Arthur. No one is polishing a lie to make it easier to swallow. Richard's phone vibrates. He checks the screen and sees 3 missed calls from the company, 2 from the development committee, 1 from a board member who knows enough about the land donation to be angry. He silences the phone and places it face down on the table. Arthur notices. Work, he says. Yes. Go? Richard looks toward the woods, then at Annie, then at his father. No, not now. Arthur studies him, as if deciding whether the answer is habit or change. Richard says, they want to talk about the land. They can wait until the land is already gone. Arthur's eyes close briefly with relief. Annie's voice is quiet. They'll be upset? Yes. Because people will get to walk there for free? Richard gives a tired smile. That is one way to say it. Clara says, some folks get offended when something beautiful stops making them money. Richard nods. I used to be one of them. Arthur opens his eyes. Used to? Richard accepts the challenge. I'm trying not to be. Annie looks at him then, not with forgiveness, but with something more cautious. Measurement. She is watching whether his words can stand past one emotional morning. Richard understands. He should be measured. A little later, Annie asks if she can see the trail before she leaves. Arthur taps twice before Richard can answer. They move slowly through the side garden. Richard pushes Arthur's chair along the paved path, while Annie and Clara walk beside them. The woods begin beyond a low stone wall. The old gate there has been locked for years, mostly from habit. Richard takes the key from the ring Paul gives him and opens it. The gate creaks. Arthur's breathing changes. Richard steps aside. Dad? Arthur lifts one trembling hand toward the path. Open, he says. Richard pushes the gate wider. Annie looks down the trail. Sunlight falls through the trees in broken pieces. The lake is barely visible beyond the bend. It's beautiful, she says. Arthur taps twice. Clara says, a place like this shouldn't sit behind a lock forever. Richard looks at the key in his hand. Then he removes it from the ring and places it in Arthur's palm. Arthur closes his shaking fingers around it. Richard says, until the transfer is complete, it's yours. After that, It belongs to everyone. Arthur's eyes fill. Annie watches the old man hold the key, and something in her face softens. She still looks tired, still hurt. But for the first time, the house is not the only thing around her. There are trees, air, room to breathe. Arthur turns his head toward her. "Thank you," he says. Annie's tears return, but she smiles through them this time. "For what, sir?" Arthur looks at his signed hand, then at the open gate. "Helping me." Annie kneels beside his chair on the garden path. "You were the one who knew what you wanted." Arthur taps twice. Richard stands behind them with the key no longer in his possession and the phone no longer in his hand. For most of his life, he has believed power means holding the lock. Now he watches his father, weak in body but clear in purpose, teach him that sometimes power means opening the gate and stepping back. They stay by the open gate longer than anyone planned. Arthur holds the key in his left hand, his fingers curled around it as if it is not metal but memory. The old trail waits beyond the stone wall, quiet under the oak branches. For years it has belonged to the estate on paper, but in Arthur's eyes it has always belonged to something larger than the Harlan name. Richard stands behind the wheelchair, unsure whether to move or speak. He has learned in the past day that his first instinct is often the one that needs questioning. Annie kneels beside Arthur for a moment more, then slowly rises. Clara watches her daughter carefully, ready to step in if the hurt becomes too heavy. Annie wipes her cheeks with both hands and looks down the path. "Did Mrs. Harlan walk there every day?" she asks. Arthur breathes in, then nods. "Sunday. After church?" Tap, tap. Annie smiles faintly. "With biscuits?" Arthur's mouth moves, almost a smile. "Peaches." Richard looks at his father. "She told Annie more in a few weeks than she told me in years." Arthur turns his head toward him. "No, I tried." Richard accepts the correction. "You tried." "I didn't hear it." Clara steps closer to the gate, looking through it. Some memories need quiet around them. Hard to hear them when a man is always rushing. Richard nods. "Yes, ma'am." The phone in Richard's pocket vibrates again. He does not check it. Arthur hears it anyway, and gives him a sideways look. "Company," Arthur says. "Probably." "Land?" "Probably." Arthur looks toward the trail. "Go. Tell." Richard frowns. "Tell them what?" Arthur's hand tightens around the key. "Mine. Gift." Richard understands. The donation cannot be hidden behind Daniel's paperwork. His board, his investors, and his executives must hear it from him. They must also understand that the land is no longer a future project, no longer a private asset waiting for a better market. It is Arthur's gift. "I'll call them from the porch," Richard says. Arthur taps once, then shakes his head. "In person?" Richard asks. Tap, tap. Richard looks toward Annie and Clara. "I don't want to leave." Arthur answers. "Go, come, back." There is a command in those broken words. Not business authority, but fatherhood. Richard has ignored enough of his father's wishes. He will not ignore this one. They return to the house slowly. Annie walks beside Clara, quieter now. Richard notices she keeps distance from the staff corridors without seeming to mean to. Hurt has mapped the house for her. The front door may be open, but her body remembers the back. Inside, Lila helps Arthur settle in the study. Richard asks Arthur if he wants tea before he leaves, and Arthur taps once, then points to Annie. Annie understands. "You want me to choose?" Tap, tap. She looks unsure. "Only if it's all right." Richard says, "It's all right if you want to." She goes to the tea tray and chooses chamomile instead of black tea. No caffeine. His hands have worked enough today. Arthur taps twice. Richard watches, learning again. Before he leaves, he turns to Annie and Clara. "I need to go to the office. My father wants me to tell the board about the donation in person." "You don't have to stay." Annie looks at Arthur. He is watching her with tired hope. "I can stay until Mama needs to leave," she says. Clara adds, "And I stay with her." "Of course," Richard says. Clara's expression tells him she expected him to object. When he does not, some of the tightness leaves her face, though not all. Richard looks at Annie. "No one will ask you to work." Annie's answer is soft. Sometimes sitting with somebody is work too. He thinks of his father sitting alone while he paid for care from a distance. "Yes, it is." At the office, the Harlan Development Board is already waiting. Richard enters the conference room without the usual stack of folders. Men and women in pressed suits look up from tablets and coffee cups. At the far end, Martin Voss, the Chief Development Officer, stands beside a rendering of what the 40-acre parcel could have become. Cottages, private paths, a spa, discreet luxury framed as nature. Martin begins before Richard sits. "We need to address the issue with your father's land before it becomes public. Daniel Price's office filed preliminary paperwork. I assume this was done without your full review." Richard remains standing. "It was done with my father's consent." Martin hesitates. "Arthur is not in a position to evaluate the commercial impact. My father is in a position to decide what belongs to him." A woman from finance, Caroline Ames, leans forward. "Richard, that parcel affects 3 long-term projections. If it moves to a public land trust, we lose development rights permanently." "Yes." The room shifts. Martin says, "You can challenge it." "I won't." "Then delay it." "No." "Richard, with respect, this is emotional." Richard looks at the rendering. Clean lines, private decks, artificial ponds where a real lake already exists. He once approved that image, with barely a glance. "Yes," he says, "it is emotional. Land often is when people remember what happened on it." Caroline speaks more gently. "This is not only about sentiment. We have obligations. My first obligation today is to stop treating my father as if weakness in his hand means weakness in his will." No one answers quickly. Martin's voice tightens. "This company was built on land decisions, hard decisions. My father built this company," Richard says. "And before that, he built a life. He wants 40 acres preserved for public use in honor of my mother. That is the decision." Another board member asks, "What about the public statement?" Richard has thought of that on the drive. "We state the truth. Arthur Harlan is donating the land to Low Country Public Land Trust. Harlan Development supports the donation." Martin looks displeased. "That makes it sound voluntary on our part." "It is voluntary on mine." The room goes quiet again. Richard places both hands on the table. "There is something else. Effective immediately. Our company will review treatment standards for domestic workers, contracted caregivers, and service staff in every Harlan-owned residence and hospitality property." Martin blinks. "What does that have to do with the land?" "Everything, if you understand what happened in my house." Caroline studies him. "Do we need legal counsel present?" "Probably," Richard says, "but I'm saying it anyway. A young woman in my father's home was falsely accused because people with power believed suspicion before truth. I was one of them. That will not happen under my name without consequences again." Martin lowers his voice. "Richard, be careful." "I was careful yesterday," Richard says. "That was the problem. I called prejudice caution." No one speaks. He looks around the room, seeing discomfort, surprise, and in a few faces, respect he has not earned yet. "Draft the statement. Remove the development parcel from all projections, and send me a plan for the worker treatment review by Friday." Martin's jaw tightens. "And if the board objects?" Richard picks up the rendering and turns it face down. "Then they can object to my father, the land trust, and every person in Charleston who will soon have a trail they do not need a gate code to walk." When Richard returns home late in the afternoon, the house feels different again. Not fixed, never that quickly, but less afraid. He finds Arthur on the porch with Annie and Clara. Lila has brought lemonade. Annie is reading aloud from a brochure Daniel left about the future preserve. Arthur listens with his eyes half closed. Richard stops in the doorway. Arthur opens one eye. "Done?" "Yes." "Fight?" "A little." "Win?" Richard looks at Annie, then at the trees. "Not sure that's the word." Arthur taps once, thinking. Annie closes the brochure. "Maybe some things aren't won. Maybe they're just finally given back." Arthur taps twice. Richard sits across from her. "That's better than what I said." Annie shrugs, but there is the smallest ease in her face. Clara looks at Richard. "Did you tell them about her?" "I did not use Annie's name." Annie looks relieved. "I said enough about myself," Richard adds. Clara nods. "Good. Her pain is not your press release." Richard accepts that. "No, ma'am." Arthur reaches for his tea. Richard starts to move, then stops. Annie notices. Ask him, she says. Richard turns to Arthur. Would you like help? Arthur taps twice. Richard steadies the cup. Arthur drinks. Annie watches, not smiling, but not pulling away from the moment either. The evening light moves across the porch boards. Somewhere beyond the gate, the trail waits for its new life. Inside the house, the staff works without Margaret's sharp voice cutting through the halls. On the porch, an old man drinks tea with help he has chosen. A young woman sits where she once would have stood, and Richard begins to understand that change is not a speech made once. It is a door opened again every day, even when shame follows you through it. The following morning, Richard finds Arthur already awake on the porch, facing the trees with the blue cup beside him and the folded land trust brochure resting on his lap. Lila says he asked to be taken outside before breakfast. Richard knows what that means now. Arthur is waiting. She may not come today, Richard says. Arthur does not turn. Tap, tap. Richard almost smiles. You want me to ask anyway? Tap, tap. He calls Clara, not Annie. The call is answered after the fourth ring. Mr. Harlan, Clara says. Good morning, Mrs. Carter. I'm calling to ask if Annie would like to visit my father today. No pressure, no work. A pause follows. Richard hears the faint sound of dishes. Then Clara covering the phone with her hand. He waits. Waiting still feels unnatural, but he is beginning to understand that impatience is just another way of taking control. Clara comes back. She says she'll come after lunch. She has paperwork to finish for school. Richard looks toward Arthur. Thank you. Please tell her there is no rush. She heard you, Clara says, and the line goes dead. Richard lowers the phone. After lunch, Arthur closes his eyes. Tap, tap. At noon, Daniel Price arrives with 2 representatives from Low Country Public Land Trust, a woman named Helen Brooks, and a retired park ranger named Thomas Green. They wear simple clothes, carry folders, and speak to Arthur directly. Richard watches his father answer slowly, sometimes with words, sometimes with taps, sometimes with a look toward the trees. Helen kneels slightly so Arthur does not have to strain his neck. Mr. Harlan, we want you to know the trail will keep your wife's name. We'll maintain the lake path, add benches, and keep the old oaks untouched. Arthur's mouth trembles. No, fences. No fences that keep the public out, Thomas says. Only safety rails where needed. Arthur taps twice. Richard stands near the porch rail, listening. A year ago, he would have let lawyers handle this. He would have signed whatever needed signing and moved on to a larger matter. Now he understands that this is the larger matter. Daniel turns to Richard. The board has accepted the donation. We can announce it tomorrow if your father agrees. Arthur looks toward Richard. Richard answers carefully. It's your gift, Dad. Your decision. Arthur studies him, then taps twice. Helen smiles. Then tomorrow it is. After they leave, Richard walks with Daniel to the drive. Daniel gives him a look that is both professional and personal. The statement you sent is direct, Daniel says. Too direct? No. Just unusual for you. Richard looks toward the house. Unusual is probably overdue. Daniel closes his folder. There may be questions about the incident with Annie. Her name stays out of it unless she chooses otherwise. Good. Richard looks at him. If she wants a written letter clearing her of any accusation, I want it done today. I already drafted one. Richard lets out a breath. Thank you. Daniel's voice softens. Richard, apologies matter. Records matter too. A young woman like Annie can carry a false accusation for years if it follows her. I know. Daniel does not let him off easy. You know because someone explained it to you. Make sure you remember when no one is explaining. Richard nods. Annie arrives just after 1 with Clara. She carries a folder instead of the nursing notebook today. Her face is calmer, though her eyes still hold the guarded look of someone entering a place where pain happened recently. Richard opens the front door himself. Good afternoon, he says. Annie nods. Good afternoon. Arthur hears her voice from the porch and calls, Annie. Her face changes at once, softening through the hurt. She goes to him, Clara beside her. Hey, Mr. Harlan. Arthur points to the chair near him. You want me to sit? Tap, tap. She sits. Richard remains standing until Clara looks at him. You can sit. Hovering makes everybody nervous. Arthur gives one rough breath that almost becomes a laugh. Richard sits. Annie opens her folder. I brought my school forms. I thought maybe I could work on them while Mr. Harlan rests. Arthur taps twice, approving. Richard says, Daniel prepared a letter for you. It states clearly that you did nothing improper, that the accusation was false, and that you acted with care at my father's request. You can use it for school or work if you ever need to. Annie's fingers tighten on the folder. A letter? Yes, only if you want it. Clara's face hardens with emotion. Get the letter. Richard goes inside and returns with the envelope. He hands it to Annie, not Clara, not Arthur. Annie reads the first lines, then stops because her eyes fill. It says I was honest, she whispers. Richard's throat tightens. You were. It says I protected his dignity. Arthur taps twice, hard enough for everyone to hear. Annie presses the paper to her chest. Thank you, Richard says. You should not have needed a letter to prove what was true. No, Clara says. But she has one now. For a while, the porch settles into ordinary sounds. Lila brings chicken salad sandwiches, iced tea, and peach slices because Arthur has been asking for peaches since the trail conversation. Annie helps Arthur only when he asks. Richard notices how she keeps checking his face. Not his money, not the house, not the staff. She watches whether he is comfortable. She watches whether he is tired. That kind of attention cannot be faked for long. Arthur points to Annie's folder. School? She nods. Community college first. Nursing assistant program if I get in. Maybe registered nurse later. Arthur taps twice. Richard asks, do you need a recommendation? Annie's face closes a little. He raises a hand gently. Not money, not pressure. Just a letter about your character if you want one. From my father or Daniel. Not from me unless you ask. She studies him. You're learning to put the choice at the end of the offer. Richard gives a small nod. Trying, Clara says. Trying is useful only if it survives inconvenience. Arthur taps twice. Annie looks down at her forms. A letter from Mr. Harlan would mean a lot. Arthur straightens slightly. Proud. Yes. Richard says. Daniel can help him write it in his words. Arthur points at Annie. Good. Nurse. Annie's face breaks into tears so suddenly that Clara reaches for her. Annie covers her mouth, shaking. I'm sorry, she says. I don't know why I keep crying. Clara puts an arm around her. Because yesterday didn't leave just because today is kinder. Arthur reaches for Annie's hand. She gives it to him. Richard looks away, not because he is bored or ashamed to see tears, but because he finally understands that her tears are not his to manage. He does not need to stop them to make himself comfortable. Later in the afternoon, Paul comes to the porch with a sealed drive containing the security footage. Mr. Harlan, Mr. Price asked for this copy. Richard takes it. Make another for Annie. Annie looks up. For me? Yes. If anyone ever questions what happened, you should have the truth too. Clara nods slowly. That is right. Annie's hand trembles when she takes the second drive. I don't want to watch it. You don't have to, Richard says, but it belongs to you as much as it belongs to us. She closes her fingers around it. Near evening, Helen from the Land Trust calls to confirm the small announcement ceremony for the next day. Arthur wants Annie there. Richard asks. Not assumes. Would you like to attend? Annie looks uncertain. As what? Richard answers, as yourself. Clara watches him closely. Annie does too. Arthur taps twice. Annie looks toward the trail beyond the yard. Will there be people from outside the estate? Yes. Then I'll come, she says. Not because people need to know what happened to me, but because they should see what he did. Arthur's eyes fill. Richard nods. They will. As Clara and Annie prepare to leave, Arthur grows quiet. He holds the key to the trail again, the one Richard gave him the day before. He motions Annie closer and places it in her palm. Annie looks startled. Mr. Harlan, I can't take this. Arthur closes her fingers around it with his shaking hand. Tomorrow, he says. Open. She understands slowly. He wants her to open the gate at the ceremony. Tears rise again, but this time she lets them fall without apology. Yes, sir, she says. If you want me to. Tap, tap. Richard watches the key pass from his father's hand to Annie's, and something in him settles into a deeper kind of shame, one that no longer only punishes him, it teaches him. The girl he accused of stealing has been trusted with the key. The father he thought he was protecting has chosen who should open the gate, and the gate, tomorrow, will not open for wealth, or pride, or the Harlan name alone. It will open because a man in a wheelchair still has a will, and a young woman he wronged still has enough grace to stand beside him while the world sees it. The morning of the ceremony brings people to the Harlan estate who have never been invited past the gate before. They arrive in modest cars and pickup trucks, in church clothes, work boots, pressed shirts, and sun hats. Some are from the land trust. Some are neighbors who remember when the old trail could still be seen from the road before the hedges grew high and the iron gate became more than decoration. A few are former workers from Harlan Properties, men and women who knew Arthur from years when he still walked job sites with mud on his shoes and remembered names without needing an assistant. Richard stands near the front steps, watching them come in. For most of his life, arrivals at the estate meant donors, executives, lawyers, and people who knew how to speak in rooms with expensive furniture. This crowd is different. They do not look impressed by the size of the house. They look toward the trees. That should have told him something years ago. Arthur waits on the side porch in his wheelchair, dressed in a navy jacket Lila helped choose because it was Louise's favorite color on him. His hands shake more than usual this morning. Excitement does that to him, so does fatigue. Richard notices both. "Would you like to rest before we begin?" Richard asks. Arthur gives him one tap. "Maybe?" Arthur gives him a look. Richard almost smiles. That means no. Tap, tap. Lila brings a folded handkerchief and tucks it into Arthur's jacket pocket. "You look handsome, Mr. Harlan." Arthur's mouth moves toward a smile. "Louise?" She'd say the same. Lila answers, and her own eyes grow wet. Paul comes from the driveway. "Sir, Mrs. Carter and Annie are here." Arthur turns his head at once. Richard walks to the front of the house. Annie steps out of Clara's car holding the key in one hand and a small envelope in the other. She is dressed simply, not in uniform, not in anything meant to impress the Harlans. Her blouse is pale blue, her hair pulled back, her face quiet but tense. Clara stands beside her in a dark dress and flat shoes, one hand near Annie's back, not pushing, only reminding her she is not alone. Richard stops several feet away. "Good morning," he says. Annie nods. "Good morning." Clara looks past him toward the gathering. "More people than I expected." "Yes, if that makes Annie uncomfortable, we can change how we do this." Annie looks at the key in her palm. "No. Mr. Harlan asked me to open the gate. I said I would." Richard nods. He's on the porch. They walk together around the side of the house. Some staff members stand near the porch. Not as an audience this time, but as part of the day. Beth lowers her eyes when Annie passes, then quietly says, "Good morning, Annie." Annie answers, "Good morning." It is not warmth, but it is not silence. Marcy does not speak. She only steps back to make room. Arthur's face changes when he sees Annie. The worry leaves first, then something like peace comes over him. He lifts his shaking hand. "Key?" he asks. Annie opens her palm. "Right here." Tap, tap. She gives him the envelope. "This is for you. It's just a note. You don't have to read it now." Arthur looks at it, then at Richard. Richard says, "Do you want me to hold it for later?" Arthur taps twice. Richard takes the envelope and places it carefully inside Arthur's jacket pocket, beside the handkerchief. Helen Brooks from the Land Trust calls everyone toward the old stone wall where the locked gate stands open only a crack. A small wooden sign is covered with cloth. The crowd gathers in a loose half-circle. No stage has been built. Arthur refused one. He did not want ceremony to become performance. He wanted the gate opened. Richard pushes Arthur's wheelchair to the front, then steps back. For once, he is not the center of the event. Arthur is. Helen speaks first. She thanks Arthur Harlan for donating the land and explains that the trail will be open to the public after safety work is completed. She speaks of old trees, native plants, the lake path, and preserving a place where people can walk without buying anything, joining anything, or proving they have a right to breathe clean air under shade. Then she invites Richard to say a few words. He has a paper in his jacket pocket. He does not take it out. "My father built many things in his life," Richard says. "Buildings, roads, a company, a name that I inherited before I understood the weight of it. But this land was never just an asset to him. It was where my mother walked. It was where he remembered her. It was where he wanted people to feel welcome, long after he could no longer walk the path himself. Arthur's eyes stay on the gate. Richard continues, and his voice slows. A few days ago, I almost stood in the way of his wish because I thought I knew better. I have done that too often. I have mistaken control for care. I have mistaken money for protection, and I have mistaken suspicion for wisdom. The crowd grows still. Annie looks down at the key. Richard does not look at her when he speaks next, because he will not make her pain a public display without permission. There are people who helped my father be heard when others, including me, were not listening. This preserve exists because he knew what mattered, and because someone had the patience to help him hold a pen without taking away his choice. Arthur's hand trembles on the armrest. Tap, tap. Richard turns to his father. Yes, Dad. Helen gently removes the cloth from the sign. Harlan Louise Public Preserve, donated in honor of Louise Harlan. For every person who deserves a place to breathe, a low murmur moves through the crowd. Clara presses her lips together. Lila wipes her eyes. Annie reads the words once, then again, as if trying to hold them steady inside herself. Arthur motions toward her. Richard bends close. You want Annie? Tap. Tap. Annie steps forward. The crowd parts without being asked. She kneels slightly beside Arthur. Yes, sir? Arthur points to the gate. Her hand tightens around the key. Now? Tap, tap. She stands, but her knees feel weak. Clara steps closer. You can do it, Clara says. Annie walks to the gate. The lock is old and stiff. For one painful second, the key does not turn. Her hand trembles, and Richard sees the memory cross her face. Hands accused, hands filmed, hands blamed for helping. He takes one step forward, then stops. This is hers to do if she wants to do it. Annie breathes in, steadies the key, and turns it. The lock opens. The sound is small, metal releasing metal, but to Arthur it is everything. His face folds. He lowers his head and cries without hiding it. Annie opens the gate wide. People do not rush in. They wait. Arthur lifts his hand. Go, he says. Helen and Thomas lead the first few guests onto the trail. Clara walks beside Annie. Lila follows with Beth, Paul, and some of the staff. Richard stays behind with Arthur until his father reaches for his sleeve. You too. Richard looks down at him. With you? Tap. Tap. Richard pushes the wheelchair slowly through the gate. The path has been cleared enough for Arthur's chair to pass over the first stretch. Leaves shift under the wheels. The lake appears between the trees, bright in the morning light. Annie walks a few feet ahead with Clara. She turns once to make sure Arthur is all right. Richard sees it. Even after all the hurt, she still checks on the old man. Arthur sees it too. Good, he says. Richard's throat tightens. Yes, she is. Arthur turns his head slightly. Remember. Richard looks at Annie, then at the open gate behind them, then at the people walking where a lock used to stop them. I will, he says. Arthur's answer is 2 taps against the armrest, almost lost beneath the sound of feet on the trail, but Richard hears them clearly. Yes. The trail does not become public in a single moment. It opens in small steps, one person passing through the gate, then another, then a few more moving slowly beneath the oaks, as if the land itself has asked them to lower their voices. Richard pushes Arthur's wheelchair over the first stretch of packed dirt that Thomas and the Land Trust volunteers have prepared. The wheels bump once over a root, and Richard stops. Are you all right? Arthur gives one tap, then looks ahead. Maybe, Richard says, learning the answer. We'll go slower. Tap, tap. Annie walks a few steps ahead with Clara, but she keeps turning back. She does it without thinking. Richard notices each time. So does Arthur. The old man's face softens whenever he sees her checking whether the chair is moving safely. After everything that happened, she still cares. That truth humbles Richard more than any speech could. Helen guides guests toward the lake overlook, where a few folding chairs have been placed for those who need to rest. Lila carries a basket of biscuits wrapped in cloth. Beth brings paper cups and lemonade from a cooler. Paul stands near the gate, not as security keeping people out, but as someone helping them find the easiest path in. The change is small, but Richard feels it. Yesterday, the gate protected the estate from the public. Today, the house is learning how to welcome people without making them feel examined. An older man in a brown hat stops near Arthur's chair. His face is lined from years in the sun, and he removes his hat before speaking. "Mr. Harlan, I don't know if you remember me. My name's Earl Jackson. I worked foundation crews for you back in '89. Arthur studies him. His hand shifts. Tap, tap. Earl smiles. "Well, I'll be. You do remember." Arthur's mouth works slowly. "Bridge. Job." "That's right," Earl says, laughing softly. "You caught me eating lunch under the truck because it was the only shade on site." Arthur's lips lift. Earl looks toward the trail. "My wife used to say this was the prettiest patch of land in the county. We never thought we'd get to walk it." Richard feels the weight of that simple sentence. We never thought we'd get to walk it. A path can be beautiful and still be a wound if it is kept behind a lock long enough. Arthur points toward the trail. "Walk." Earl nods. "Yes, sir. I believe I will." As Earl leaves, Clara moves closer to Richard. "Your father remembers working people." Richard watches Arthur greeting another former employee with one slow nod. He does. "Do you?" The question is quiet, but Richard knows better than to answer too quickly. "I'm starting to understand how much I forgot." Clara looks at him. Forgetting is easy when people keep opening doors for you. Richard accepts that. "Yes, ma'am." Annie has reached the lake overlook. She stands near the wooden rail, looking out at the water. The surface reflects the pale sky and the hanging moss, broken only by the movement of leaves in the wind. Clara joins her, but Richard stays with Arthur. Arthur touches Richard's wrist. "Her," he says. Richard follows his father's gaze. "Annie?" Tap, tap. "You want to speak to her?" Tap, tap. Richard wheels him toward the overlook. Annie turns when she hears the chair. Her hands fold in front of her. A habit from the house. Then she catches herself and lets them fall at her sides. Arthur motions her closer. She kneels beside him, careful not to block his view of the lake. "Are you tired, Mr. Harlan?" Tap once. "Maybe?" Tap, tap. She almost smiles. "You're stubborn." Arthur's eyes warm. "You, too." For the first time, Annie lets out a small laugh. It is fragile, but real. Richard hears it and feels both relief and sorrow. Relief that the sound exists. Sorrow that his house nearly silenced it. Arthur reaches into his jacket pocket. His hand fumbles with the envelope Annie gave him earlier. Richard helps only when Arthur looks at him and taps twice. "Do you want me to take it out?" Tap, tap. Richard pulls the envelope free and gives it to Arthur. Arthur places it in Annie's hand. She blinks. "That's my note to you." Arthur shakes his head and points to her. "You want me to read it?" Tap, tap. Annie's face turns shy and sad. "Now?" Tap, tap. Clara stands behind her daughter. "Only if you want to, baby." Annie opens the envelope with trembling fingers. The paper inside is folded once. Her handwriting is careful, but some of the ink has blurred where tears must have fallen. She reads softly, not for the crowd, only for Arthur and the few close enough to hear. "Dear Mr. Harlan, I am sorry yesterday hurt you. I know you tried to speak for me. I saw your hand reaching, and I knew you believed me, even when no one else did. Thank you for trusting me when I was scared to trust myself. I hope the woods make people feel the way you wanted Mrs. Harlan to be remembered. Peaceful, kind, and free." By the last word, Annie's voice breaks. Arthur closes his eyes. Tears move down his face. He lifts his hand, and Annie takes it. "Good," he says. Annie wipes her cheek. "The note?" Arthur shakes his head. "You," he says. She bows her head over his hand and cries quietly. Clara places a hand on her shoulder. Richard looks away for a moment, not to avoid the emotion, but to give it room. Helen approaches Richard and speaks quietly. "The local paper is here. They want a photo of Mr. Harlan by the sign." Richard looks toward Annie. "No photo including Annie unless she agrees." Helen nods. "Of course." Annie hears anyway. She looks up. "It's all right if I stand with him," Richard says. "You do not have to." "I know," Annie answers. "I want people to see him. And I want them to know he chose this." Arthur taps twice. The photographer gathers a small group near the sign. Arthur in his wheelchair. Richard beside him. Annie on the other side. Clara close to her daughter. Helen and Thomas behind them. Richard stands with his hands at his sides, careful not to place himself over the moment. Annie holds the key loosely in one hand. Arthur reaches for it. then places his hand over hers. The camera clicks. For most people, it will be a picture of a land donation. For Richard, it will become something else. Evidence that a man can stand beside the person he wronged and still not be the center of the story. After the photo, guests begin walking back toward the house for lemonade and biscuits. Arthur grows tired. His head dips once, then lifts. Annie notices first. He needs rest, she says. Richard bends toward his father. Would you like to go back to the porch? Arthur taps twice. On the way back, Marcy steps out from near the refreshments table. Her face is pale, and she wrings her hands. Annie, she says. Annie stops but does not step closer. Marcy swallows. I'm sorry. I repeated what Mrs. Bell said. I didn't know, but I acted like I did. Annie looks at her for a long moment. Why? Marcy's eyes fill. Because it made me feel safer to stand with the person in charge. Annie's voice is soft. It made me unsafe. Marcy nods, crying now. I know. No. Annie says. You know now. Marcy looks down. Yes, Annie does not forgive her. She does not punish her either. She simply says, don't do it to somebody else. I won't. Richard hears that and feels the sentence enter him too. Back on the porch, Arthur rests with a blanket over his knees. Lila brings him tea, and Richard asks before helping him drink. Annie sits with Clara near the railing, the key in her lap. People continue to pass through the open gate in the distance. Some walk slowly, some stop to read the sign. A few stand at the entrance, as if needing a moment before stepping onto land that used to be withheld from them. Richard sits beside his father. Arthur looks at him. See? Richard follows his gaze to the gate. The people, Annie holding the key, Clara sitting beside her with one hand over her daughter's. Yes, Richard says. I see. Arthur's eyes narrow slightly, asking for more. Richard takes a breath. I see what money kept me from seeing. I see what suspicion did. I see that opening the gate is not the same as repairing what happened inside the house. Arthur taps twice. Annie hears him and looks over. Richard meets her eyes. I won't ask you to make today easier for me. She studies him, then gives a small nod. Good. The afternoon stretches gently. When guests begin to leave, many stop to thank Arthur. He tires quickly, but he insists on acknowledging each person. Richard does not rush them. Not once. Near the end of the day, Annie stands. We should go, Mama. Arthur's hand moves at once. Tomorrow? He asks. Annie's face tightens with emotion. I have class forms tomorrow. Arthur looks disappointed but nods. She adds, maybe the day after, if you still want me to visit. Arthur taps twice before she finishes the sentence. Annie smiles through tears. All right. Richard walks Annie and Clara to their car. This time he does not carry anything for them unless asked. At the car door, Annie turns to him. Today was good for him. Yes, Richard says. It was good for the land too. He nods. She looks back toward the house. But don't let everybody turn this into a pretty story and forget the ugly part. Richard feels the truth of that. I won't. Annie holds his gaze. You have to remember it when people stop watching. Richard says, I know. She gets into the car. Clara gives Richard one final look through the open window. You're not done, Clara says. No, Mom. Good. Done men get lazy. The old sedan pulls away. Richard remains in the drive until it passes through the gate, the same gate Annie opened that morning. When he returns to the porch, Arthur is asleep in his wheelchair, the blanket rising and falling with his breath. The sign beyond the lawn catches the late light. People are still walking the trail. Richard sits beside his father and does not wake him. He watches the open gate until the shadows lengthen, knowing the day has not washed him clean. It has only shown him the work ahead. That evening, after the last car leaves and the trail grows quiet, Richard stays on the porch beside Arthur. The old man sleeps in his wheelchair with the blanket over his knees, his head tilted slightly toward the open gate. The house behind them is calmer than Richard has ever known it. Not perfect, not forgiven, just quieter in a way that no longer feels controlled by fear. Lila comes out with a cup of tea and sets it beside Richard. He should be in bed soon. Richard nods. I'll take him. She looks toward the trail. Mrs. Harlan would have liked today. Arthur's eyes open a little. His mouth moves. Richard leans closer. Dad? Arthur whispers, Yes. Lila wipes the corner of her eye with her apron. I'll get his room ready. When she leaves, Richard looks at his father. You heard her? Arthur taps twice beneath the blanket. Richard almost smiles, then looks down at his hands. I used to think hearing meant answering right away. Arthur's eyes stay half open. Richard says, You've been answering for a long time. I just didn't wait. Arthur's hand shifts, searching. Richard offers his hand, but stops before touching him. Arthur moves his fingers closer, and only then does Richard take them. They sit that way until the first evening insects begin their thin music beyond the porch. 2 days later, Annie returns after finishing her school paperwork. She comes through the front door with Clara, carrying the nursing folder and the letter Daniel prepared. She does not look as frightened as before, but she still pauses at the threshold. Richard does not pretend not to notice. You can take all the time you need, he says. Annie gives him a small nod. I know where the door is now. Yes, Richard says, and it stays open. Arthur is waiting in the study by the window. On the desk sits a fresh sheet of stationery with his name printed at the top. Daniel has helped prepare a recommendation letter for Annie, but Arthur insists on adding a line himself. His hand shakes too much to write clearly, so Daniel has written the words Arthur chose, leaving a space for Arthur's mark. Annie sits beside him. You don't have to do all this, Mr. Harlan. Arthur looks almost offended. Do. Richard stands near the desk but says nothing. He has learned that silence can be respect when it leaves room for someone else. Daniel reads the letter aloud. It says, Annie Carter acted with care, patience, and honesty. It says she treated Arthur Harlan with dignity, at a time when dignity was what he needed most. It says any nursing program would be fortunate to accept a student who understands that care begins with listening. Annie cries before the last sentence. Clara puts a hand on her shoulder. Let it come, baby. Arthur reaches for the pen. Richard asks, Would you like help? Arthur looks at Annie. Annie says softly, He's asking you, sir. Arthur turns back and taps twice. Richard supports his father's wrist, light and careful. Arthur makes a slow, uneven mark beside his printed name. It is not pretty, but it is his. Annie holds the letter with both hands when Daniel gives it to her. I'll keep this forever. Arthur taps once, then twice. Maybe? Annie asks, smiling through tears. Arthur's mouth lifts. Use. She laughs quietly. All right, I'll use it first. Over the next weeks, the Harlan house changes in ways visitors might not notice at once. The service entrance remains, because deliveries and kitchen work still need practical paths, but no one is told it is the only door for them. Staff meetings include Lila, Paul, Beth, and others who used to hear rules after decisions were made. Complaints are written down. Accusations require proof. Richard pays for an outside review of every household policy and every Harlan property where service workers live or work. Some executives call it excessive. Richard calls it late. Annie does not return as a maid. That is her decision. She visits Arthur twice a week when school forms and her mother's schedule allow. Sometimes she reads to him from the newspaper. Sometimes they sit by the window without speaking. Sometimes Richard sits with them, learning when to talk and when to let a pause remain whole. One afternoon, Arthur asks for the trail. Richard pushes his wheelchair through the open gate, while Annie walks beside them. The public path has been cleared farther now. A bench has been installed near the lake with a small plaque for Louise Harlan. People pass by and nod to Arthur. Some know him. Some only know the sign. He greets them as best he can. A woman stops to thank him for the preserve. My husband and I walk here every morning now, she says. It's brought him peace. Arthur looks toward Richard. See? He says. Richard nods. I say. The woman continues down the path. Annie stands near the lake, watching the water move under the wind. Richard walks up beside her, leaving enough space between them. I heard from Daniel. Your application packet is complete. She looks at him. He told you? He only said the letter was submitted. Nothing private. Annie nods. I'm nervous. You'll be a good nurse. She glances at him. You sound like your father. That may be the best thing anyone has said to me in a long time. She does not smile, but her face softens a little. After a moment, she says, I still remember what you said. Richard looks toward the lake. I know, not every minute, but sometimes. when I'm holding a pen, when someone watches me too closely, when I walk into a room and feel people deciding something. Richard closes his eyes briefly. I'm sorry. I know you are. He looks at her then. Is there anything I can do now? Annie thinks about it. Yes. Don't make me the reason you changed. Make sure you change because what happened was wrong, even if I never came back. Richard lets that settle. I will. She turns to him. And don't let people praise you too much for fixing a wound you made. He nods slowly. That is fair. No, Annie says. It isn't fair. It's just honest. Arthur taps twice from his chair. Both of them look at him. Richard gives a quiet breath that almost becomes a laugh. He agrees. Annie finally smiles a little. He usually does when I'm right. Arthur taps twice again, stronger this time. Months later, when the first cool weather reaches Charleston, Annie receives her acceptance letter. She brings it to Arthur before anyone else outside her home sees it. She comes through the front door without stopping this time, though Richard still notices the way her hand brushes the handle, as if remembering. Arthur waits in the study with tea, peaches, and the blue cup. Richard sits near him. Clara stands behind Annie, proud and trying not to cry too soon. Annie opens the letter with shaking hands and reads it aloud. She has been accepted into the nursing assistant program. Arthur lifts both hands as much as he can. One shakes in the air. Richard steadies the other when Arthur asks. Clara cries openly. Annie laughs and cries at the same time. I got in, she says as if she needs the room to confirm it. Arthur says, good, nurse. Annie kneels beside him and takes his hand. Because you believed I could be. Arthur shakes his head. Because, true. Richard watches them and feels the old shame rise again, but it no longer only burns. It guides. It reminds him where he was wrong and where the work remains. Later, when Annie and Clara leave, Arthur asks to sit on the porch. Richard brings the blanket and the tea. The preserve sign is visible beyond the lawn now. Weathered a little by sun and rain, people walk the trail in the distance. Arthur looks at Richard. Better? He asks. Richard thinks before answering. The house? Arthur waits. Me? Tap, tap. Richard looks toward the open gate. Better than I was. Not finished. Arthur's face relaxes. Good. The last light of the day moves through the trees. Richard sits beside his father, not checking his phone, not rushing toward the next decision. In the distance, a few walkers pause at the sign before entering the trail. They do not know the whole story. They do not know about the money on the floor, the video that showed too little, the girl crying at the service gate, or the old man who refused to let a lie become the final word. But Richard knows, Annie knows, Arthur knows, and sometimes that is how justice survives, not as a loud victory, but as a truth remembered by the people who were there, carried forward in changed rules, open doors, careful apologies, and the courage to never again mistake suspicion for wisdom. Arthur's hand moves on the armrest. Tap, tap. Richard hears it clearly. Yes, the lesson of this story is that prejudice often hides behind words like caution, protection, and common sense. Richard believed he was defending his father, but in truth, he judged Annie before he ever listened to her. A person's worth is not measured by their age, skin color, job, or the door they are told to enter. Annie had no money or power, but she had patience, honesty, and dignity. Arthur understood that real care is not control. It is listening, waiting, and respecting another person's choice. Justice does not erase the pain caused by false judgment, but it can begin. When the truth is spoken, doors are opened, and people choose to change. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.